The first sensation was pain, a dull, throbbing ache behind his eyes that pulsed with each heartbeat. Li Wei's consciousness surfaced through layers of confusion, his mind struggling to reconcile the familiar with the impossible. He lay on cold linoleum, the scent of ozone and burnt plastic filling his nostrils. Slowly, he opened his eyes. His quantum physics laboratory was a ruin. The once pristine white walls were streaked with dark, viscous stains that shimmered with an unnatural iridescence. Shelves had been torn from their mounts, scattering glassware and equipment across the floor in glittering shards. The main observation window, reinforced to withstand electromagnetic pulses, now spiderwebbed with cracks, revealing a sky the color of bruised flesh outside. Faint, ghostly notifications flickered at the edges of his vision, pale blue text that read, System initialization, 97% complete, and, Local reality integrity, 42%. They hovered like afterimages, refusing to fade. Li Wei pushed himself up, his hand slipping on something wet. He looked down to see a puddle of congealed fluid that wasn't blood, it was too viscous, too metallic in its sheen. His lab coat was torn at the shoulder, and beneath it, his skin bore no wound, only a strange, tingling numbness. He remembered the last moments before everything went dark, the emergency sirens, the panicked announcements about a global network failure, his colleague Dr. Chen shouting something about anomalous energy readings from the particle accelerator. Then, nothing. A low groan echoed from beyond the shattered door of the lab. It was a human sound, twisted into something guttural and wrong. Li Wei froze, his breath catching in his throat. The groan came again, accompanied by the slow, dragging scrape of footsteps. He crept toward the door, peering through the jagged gap where the reinforced glass had given way. In the corridor outside, a figure shambled past. It wore the tattered remains of a lab technician's uniform, but the skin beneath was mottled with pulsing, violet veins that glowed faintly in the dim light. The head lolled at an unnatural angle, and the eyes, Li Wei felt a chill crawl down his spine, were entirely consumed by that same violet luminescence. As the creature passed, another flickering notification appeared, infected entity detected. Threat level, low. Regeneration active. Li Wei's mind, trained to observe and analyze, immediately latched onto the anomalies. The notifications weren't projected on any surface, they existed in his perception alone, overlaying reality like a heads-up display. The creature's movements defied normal biomechanics, its joints seemed to flex in ways that should have shattered bone, and the glowing veins pulsed in rhythm with the flickering system text. This wasn't a disease, it was a corruption of reality itself, a viral code rewriting physical laws. He backed away from the door, his thoughts racing. The system notifications mentioned reality integrity. If this was some kind of energy matrix imposing itself on the world, it might have vulnerabilities. His eyes swept the ruined lab, landing on the chemical storage cabinet. The lock was broken, but the contents were mostly intact, vials of reagents, powdered compounds, and emergency neutralizing agents. Among them, he spotted magnesium ribbon, potassium permanganate, and concentrated sulfuric acid, ingredients for a high-energy exothermic reaction. Another groan, closer this time. Li Wei turned to see the door handle rattling. The infected technician, no, it was Dr. Chen, he realized with a sickening lurch, was trying to force its way in. The creature's movements were more purposeful now, as if drawn by his presence. Li Wei's heart hammered against his ribs. He needed to barricade the door, but the lab's furniture was too heavy to move quickly. Instead, he grabbed a fallen steel support beam, wedging it diagonally against the doorframe. It wouldn't hold for long, but it might buy him seconds. As he worked, a new sensation washed over him, a splitting headache that felt like ice picks driving into his temples. With it came a shift in perception. The world didn't change, but he began to see it differently. The air around him shimmered with faint, geometric patterns, lines of force that intersected and pulsed with energy. They converged on the infected Dr. Chen like a web, feeding into those glowing veins. This was the system's energy matrix, a chaotic field of imposed rules that warped physics locally. Li Wei's anomaly status wasn't just a label, it was a lens through which he could perceive the underlying code of this new reality. The door shuddered under a heavy impact. Cracks spread through the remaining glass. Li Wei ignored the pain in his head and focused on the matrix. He could see points of instability, nodes where the energy field wavered, as if the system's integration with reality was still incomplete. One such node hovered near the chemical cabinet. An idea, half-formed and desperate, took shape. If the system was an energy matrix, then disrupting that energy locally might create a zone of normal physics. A reality anchor, he thought, the term surfacing from some deep, instinctual understanding. He rushed to the cabinet, his hands trembling slightly. The headache intensified, making his vision swim, but he forced himself to concentrate. Magnesium ribbon, highly reactive, producing intense light and heat when oxidized. Potassium permanganate, a strong oxidizing agent. Sulfuric acid, to catalyze the reaction. He measured by eye, pouring the powdered permanganate into a ceramic crucible, then adding the acid. The mixture began to fume, releasing acrid smoke. He coiled the magnesium ribbon and dropped it in. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a brilliant white flash, the crucible erupted in a violent reaction. Light blazed, not just visible but bleeding into the ultraviolet spectrum. Li Wei could see it distorting the energy matrix around him, causing the geometric patterns to fray and unravel. The system notifications flickered wildly, local reality integrity fluctuation detected. The effect radiated outward in a wave, stabilizing at about a 5-meter radius centered on the crucible. In that radius, the world felt different. The air lost its electric charge, the faint hum that Li Wei hadn't even consciously noticed until now fell silent. And at the door, the infected Dr. Chen staggered. The violet glow in its veins dimmed, and the creature's movements became sluggish, confused. It was as if the system's influence had been temporarily disabled, stripping away the enhancements that defied physics. Li Wei seized the opportunity. He grabbed a heavy microscope stand, swinging it with all his strength at the creature's head. Without its regenerative abilities, the impact connected with a sickening crunch. Dr. Chen collapsed, the violet light in its eyes fading to dull emptiness. Li Wei stood panting, the crucible's reaction dying down to embers. The reality anchor had worked, but the cost was evident. His headache had spiked into a blinding migraine, and a trickle of blood ran from his nose. He wiped it away, his hands shaking from adrenaline and mental exhaustion. He dragged Dr. Chen's body out of the doorway, then reinforced the barricade with more debris. The lab was secure, for now. In the sudden quiet, he allowed himself a moment to lean against a wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The reality anchor's effects were already fading, he could feel the system's energy matrix creeping back at the edges of his perception. But he had proof of concept, physics could overwrite the system's rules, if only locally and temporarily. As he caught his breath, a new notification flashed across his vision, this one in stark, crimson text. It didn't flicker, it burned with urgent clarity, anomaly detected. Viral enforcement unit dispatched. ETA, 12 hours. Li Wei's blood ran cold. He wasn't just surviving in a broken world, he was a target. The lab door groaned on rusted hinges as Li Wei pushed it open, the sound echoing through the silent corridor beyond. Morning light filtered through broken windows, casting long shadows across debris-strewn floors. He stepped out, the reality anchor device clutched in one hand, a jury-rigged contraption of copper wire, chemical vials, and a small battery pack salvaged from lab equipment. In his other hand, he carried a makeshift spear, a metal pipe with a sharpened steel rod secured at one end with electrical tape. His head still throbbed from yesterday's exertion, a dull ache behind his eyes that served as constant reminder of the system's price for defiance. The nosebleed had stopped, but dried blood crusted beneath his nostrils. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge on his lab coat sleeve. The corridor stretched before him, once pristine white walls now stained with dark splatters he didn't care to identify. Broken glass crunched under his boots as he moved cautiously forward, every sense alert. Through his anomaly perception, the world shimmered with overlapping energy fields, the chaotic matrix of the system pulsed like a diseased heartbeat, while smaller, more orderly patterns marked the remnants of electrical systems and chemical reactions in the ruined building. He reached the main entrance, its glass doors shattered outward as if something had exploded from within. Beyond lay the campus quad, once meticulously landscaped with cherry trees and stone pathways. Now it resembled a war zone. Cars lay overturned, their windows smashed. Fires smoldered in distant buildings, sending columns of black smoke into the pale sky. The air carried the scent of ozone, burning plastic, and something else, the sweet, cloying odor of decay. Li Wei paused at the threshold, scanning the open space. His eyes caught movement near the physics building across the quad. 5 figures hunched over something on the ground, their movements jerky and unnatural. Even from 50 meters away, he could see the faint glow surrounding them, the system's energy matrix sustaining their unnatural existence. He moved along the building's edge, keeping to shadows where possible. The reality anchor device hummed softly in his hand, its copper coils warm to the touch. He'd calculated its effective radius at approximately 5 meters based on yesterday's test, though maintaining that field required constant mental focus. Already he felt the beginning of that familiar pressure behind his eyes. As he drew closer, the scene became clearer. The figures were indeed zombies, 3 men and 2 women in tattered clothing that might have been student uniforms or lab coats. They crouched around what remained of a 6th body, tearing at flesh with unnatural strength. The corpse wore the distinctive blue jumpsuit of campus maintenance staff. Blood soaked the grass in a dark, spreading pool. Li Wei observed from behind a overturned delivery van, his breath coming in shallow, controlled puffs. Through his anomaly perception, he studied the zombies' energy signatures. Each displayed the same chaotic pattern he'd seen in Dr. Chen, a turbulent field of system energy that violated thermodynamic principles. But there was something new. As they fed, their glow intensified slightly, the energy matrix reinforcing itself through consumption of biomass. Regeneration through negentropy, he thought, the scientist in him analyzing even as his stomach churned at the sight. They're locally reversing entropy by drawing energy from the system matrix. But that matrix itself must obey conservation laws somewhere in the chain. One of the zombies, a young woman with half her face missing, suddenly stopped feeding and turned its head. Its remaining eye fixed on Li Wei's position. A low guttural sound emerged from its throat, and the others paused their feast, rising as one. Li Wei stepped out from behind the van, spear held ready. The reality anchor device clicked as he activated it fully. A shimmering field extended around him, distorting the air like heat haze on a summer road. The zombies hesitated at the field's edge, their movements becoming uncertain as the system's influence weakened within the 5-meter radius. But they didn't retreat. The lead zombie, a large man in a torn security guard uniform, charged forward, crossing into the field. Its glow flickered, but didn't extinguish. Li Wei realized with cold clarity, 5 zombies at once overwhelmed the anchor's capacity to fully suppress their connection to the system matrix. He backpedaled, keeping the spear between himself and the approaching creatures. His mind raced through calculations. The anchor disrupted the system's influence, but didn't destroy the energy sustaining them. To do that, he needed to introduce thermodynamic instability, to force their regeneration processes to collapse under their own contradictions. The propane torch. He'd brought it slung across his back in a makeshift harness, along with 2 small fuel canisters scavenged from the lab's Bunsen burner supplies. Limited resource, he reminded himself. Maybe 10 minutes of continuous use total. As the security guard zombie lunged, Li Wei sidestepped and brought the spear around in a clumsy arc. The sharpened steel tip caught the creature in the shoulder, tearing through rotten flesh but meeting unexpected resistance. The system-enhanced tissue was tougher than it appeared. The zombie barely flinched, grabbing for the spear shaft. Li Wei released the weapon and scrambled backward, unslinging the torch. His fingers fumbled with the igniter. Click. Click. Nothing. The third try produced a spark, and blue flame roared to life with a satisfying whoosh. The heat washed over his face as he adjusted the flame to its narrowest, hottest setting. The security guard zombie advanced again, now holding Li Wei's spear. The other 4 fanned out, attempting to surround him. Thermodynamics. Everything came down to thermodynamics. The system matrix provided energy for regeneration, but that energy had to localize somehow, to concentrate at points of damage to facilitate repair. If he could disrupt that localization. He aimed the torch not at the zombie's center mass, but at its left arm where the spear had torn flesh. The blue flame touched decaying tissue, and something remarkable happened. The system glow around the wound intensified dramatically, a brilliant corona of energy attempting to repair the damage against the intense heat. Feedback loop, Li Wei muttered, adjusting the torch to maintain optimal temperature. The matrix is trying to counteract entropy increase from the burn, but that requires even more energy localization. It's overcompensating. He watched through his anomaly perception as the energy field around the wound grew unstable, fluctuations rippling through the matrix. The zombie staggered, its movements becoming jerky. The glow pulsed erratically, bright then dim, like a failing light bulb. Then it happened, a cascade failure. The localized energy concentration collapsed, taking with it the entire system connection for that limb. The zombie's left arm didn't just stop regenerating, it began to decay at accelerated rate, flesh blackening and sloughing off in greasy chunks. The process spread upward through the shoulder, toward the torso. The creature made a sound that might have been a scream if it still had proper vocal cords. It dropped the spear and clawed at its disintegrating arm, but the decay continued unabated. Within seconds, the entire left side of its body was collapsing into foul-smelling sludge. The other zombies hesitated, their simple predator instincts conflicted by this unprecedented threat. Li Wei didn't give them time to decide. He swung the torch toward the nearest, the young woman with the missing face. A brief application of focused heat to her leg produced the same result: localized energy overload, cascade failure, permanent decay. 2 down. But his fuel gauge showed 1 canister already depleted. The remaining zombies, 2 men and 1 woman, backed away, their system-enhanced instincts recognizing this new danger. Li Wei advanced cautiously, torch held before him like a talisman. The zombies retreated further, then turned and shambled away at surprising speed, disappearing around the corner of the physics building. He stood panting in the sudden silence, the torch flame hissing softly. The ache behind his eyes had intensified to a pounding headache, and he felt the warm trickle of another nosebleed beginning. He deactivated the torch, conserving the remaining fuel. The 2 disabled zombies lay motionless, their bodies continuing to decay at visible rate. The security guard's remains had already reduced to skeleton and greasy residue. The process was complete, irreversible, true death restored through thermodynamic correction. Li Wei approached the maintenance worker's corpse, stepping carefully around the spreading blood. The man's tool belt remained intact. Li Wei unfastened it with trembling hands, trying not to look at what remained of the face. The belt contained a multi-tool, flashlight with dying batteries, coil of nylon rope, and, most valuable, a half-full bottle of water and 2 protein bars in sealed wrappers. He took everything, his scientist's practicality overriding any sentiment about looting the dead. Survival required resources. He slung the tool belt over his shoulder alongside the torch harness. As he straightened up, movement caught his eye from across the quad. Near the ruined library building, a figure emerged from shadow, a young woman in practical outdoor clothing, her dark hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She held her hands before her, and between them bloomed a sphere of flickering orange light. Li Wei stared, his anomaly perception analyzing the phenomenon. The fireball wasn't fire as physics understood it, no fuel, no oxidizer, no convection currents. Instead, it manifested as a localized distortion of the system matrix, energy converted directly to thermal radiation through some rule-based process he couldn't yet decipher. Fascinating. Horrifying. The woman, a mage, the system would classify her, hurled the fireball at something Li Wei couldn't see from his angle. An explosion of flame and light erupted against the library wall. She turned then, and her eyes met Li Wei's across the distance. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The woman's expression shifted from concentration to confusion as she took in the scene, Li Wei in his stained lab coat, the decaying zombie remains at his feet, the makeshift weapons and strange devices he carried. Her gaze lingered on the reality anchor device still humming in his hand, its copper coils glowing faintly with residual energy. Then movement behind her. Something large emerged from the library's shattered entrance, a zombie, but unlike any Li Wei had seen. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its body swollen with mismatched muscle tissue that pulsed with intense system energy. One arm ended in bone blades that scraped against the concrete as it moved. Its head was a distorted mass with too many eyes, all fixed on the mage. The woman's confidence vanished. She glanced once more at Li Wei, her expression now pure panic, then turned and fled, disappearing between 2 buildings. The massive zombie lumbered after her, its bone blades leaving deep gouges in the pavement. Li Wei remained frozen, watching the empty space where they'd vanished. The reality anchor device grew heavy in his hand. His headache pulsed in time with his heartbeat. In the distance, a crow cawed, the sound lonely in the ruined quiet. He looked down at the supplies he'd gathered, then back toward his lab. Sanctuary waited there, temporary safety behind chemical barriers and disabled system influence. But out here were survivors with impossible abilities, monsters that defied evolution, and answers he desperately needed. The mage had seen him. Had seen what he could do. That changed everything. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of smoke and decay, and began walking back toward his lab. Each step felt heavier than the last. Li Wei crouched behind the shattered remains of a campus information kiosk, his breath forming faint clouds in the cold air. The reality anchor device in his hands hummed with residual energy, its makeshift housing warm against his palms. Through his anomaly perception, the world shimmered with overlapping layers, the physical ruins of a university campus, and beneath it, the chaotic energy matrix of the system, pulsing like a diseased heartbeat across reality. He tracked the fleeing mage, not by sight but by the disturbance she left in the matrix. Her fireball spell had carved a temporary void in the system's energy field, a scar that lingered like heat haze over asphalt. The trail led away from the quad, past the skeletal remains of the engineering building, toward what had once been the campus convenience store. His footsteps crunched on broken glass as he approached. The storefront had collapsed inward, its metal frame twisted into grotesque angles by whatever cataclysm had accompanied the system virus outbreak. Shelves lay overturned, their contents, packaged snacks, bottled drinks, toiletries, scattered across the floor like confetti after a disaster. Through a gap in the wreckage, he saw movement. She was huddled behind what remained of the checkout counter, her back pressed against cracked linoleum. The mage, a young woman with dark hair matted with sweat and grime, clutched her left arm where blood seeped through torn fabric. Her breathing came in ragged gasps that fogged the cold air. When her eyes met Li Wei's through the debris, they widened with a mixture of fear and recognition. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice trembling. One hand rose weakly, fingers curling as if to summon magic that wouldn't come. "I saw what you did to those things. You're not normal." Li Wei didn't enter immediately. Instead, he knelt at the edge of the collapsed entrance, his eyes scanning the energy matrix around them. The system's field here was thinner, patchy, likely damaged by whatever structural collapse had occurred. But something else caught his attention, ripples in the matrix, converging patterns moving toward their location with alarming speed. "They're coming," he said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline tightening his chest. "Your spell drew them. 5, maybe 6. Faster than the ones in the quad." Through his anomaly perception, he could see them, not as physical forms yet, but as disturbances in the energy field. The system-enhanced zombies moved with coordinated purpose, their regeneration matrices glowing brighter than the standard variants. They were learning, adapting to hunt magic users specifically. The mage tried to stand, winced, and slumped back down. "I'm out," she gasped. "Mana pool's empty. Can't even light a candle." Li Wei calculated distances, angles, energy requirements. His reality anchor had about 70% charge remaining, based on the capacitor's hum frequency. The safe zone radius would need to be at least 8 meters to encompass both of them with margin. That would drain the battery completely, leaving him vulnerable for hours while it recharged through solar cells back at the lab. But the alternative was watching her die. "When I say now," he told her, "crawl toward me. Don't try to stand." He activated the device. The world didn't change visually, but through his anomaly senses, the effect was dramatic. A sphere of ordered reality expanded from the anchor, pushing back the chaotic system matrix like oil repelling water. Within the 8-meter radius, the energy field flattened, becoming static and predictable. The approaching disturbances in the matrix, the fast-moving zombies, suddenly slowed, their enhanced speed faltering as the system rules supporting them were locally overridden. "Now," Li Wei said. The mage didn't hesitate. She scrambled across the debris-strewn floor, wincing as glass cut through already torn pants. Li Wei reached out, grabbed her uninjured arm, and pulled her behind the relative cover of an overturned refrigerator unit. Outside their safe zone, the zombies arrived. They were different from the ones he'd encountered before, leaner, with elongated limbs that suggested specialized mutation. Their movements, now deprived of system-enhanced speed, became jerky and uncoordinated. One stumbled over rubble, its head snapping around as it tried to locate prey that should have been easy to catch. "They can't see us," the mage whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "They can," Li Wei corrected quietly. "But their targeting systems rely on system-assisted tracking. Inside this bubble, that doesn't work properly." He watched as the zombies milled about at the edge of the safe zone, confused by the contradictory data their corrupted biology was receiving. One stepped partially into the radius, and immediately its movements became sluggish, its regeneration matrix flickering erratically. "How are you doing this?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the device in his hands. "That's not magic. I'd sense it if it was." "Physics," Li Wei said simply. "The system operates on energy principles. Chaotic ones, badly implemented, but still bound by conservation laws. This device creates a localized region where those principles are, temporarily corrected." He could feel the anchor's battery draining faster than anticipated. The zombies' proximity was stressing the field, their own energy matrices fighting against the ordered reality he'd imposed. The capacitor's hum rose in pitch, a warning sign he'd noted during testing. "We need to move," he said. This won't hold them forever. Move where? They're between us and anywhere. Li Wei reached into his scavenged supplies, pulling out 3 chemical flares he'd assembled from lab materials. They were simple devices, hollow tubes filled with magnesium powder and oxidizer compounds, sealed with wax plugs. When I throw these, he explained, they'll burn at approximately 2000 degrees Celsius. The light and heat should overload their sensory systems, even outside the safe zone. We run while they're distracted. You just carry incendiary devices around. I'm a quantum physicist in a zombie apocalypse, he said dryly. Preparedness is somewhat mandatory. He lit the first flare with a spark from his multi-tool. The magnesium ignited with a brilliant white light that made both of them blink against the sudden glare. Through his anomaly perception, he saw the energy spike ripple through the system matrix, creating interference patterns that confused the zombies' tracking. He threw it in a high arc toward the far side of the street. The zombies turned as one, drawn by the sudden energy signature. Their movements became frantic, competitive, they shoved each other aside in their rush toward what their corrupted instincts told them was a potent magic source. Li Wei lit and threw 2 more flares in different directions, creating a triangle of distractions. The safe zone flickered as the anchor's battery dipped below critical levels. Go, he shouted, grabbing the mage's arm again. They ran. The journey back to his lab was a blur of adrenaline and pain. Li Wei supported her as best he could, her injured arm slung over his shoulders. Twice they had to detour around clusters of standard zombies, their movements sluggish in the afternoon light. Each time, Li Wei monitored the energy matrix, looking for the fast-moving variants that might have broken away from the flare distraction. His nose began to bleed again halfway there, a thin trickle of crimson that dripped onto his scavenged jacket. The mental strain of maintaining anomaly perception while physically exerting himself was taking its toll. Behind his eyes, a headache built like pressure in a sealed chamber. They reached the lab just as the sun dipped below the ruined skyline. Li Wei keyed in the security code, a sequence he'd reprogrammed after the outbreak, and the reinforced door hissed open. He half-carried the mage inside, then sealed the entrance behind them. The familiar hum of his makeshift Faraday cage enveloped them, a blanket of silence against the system's constant background noise. For a long moment, they simply stood there, breathing in the relative safety of the space. The lab was as he'd left it, workbenches organized with scientific precision, whiteboards covered in equations analyzing system energy patterns, the reality anchor's charging station glowing with soft blue LEDs. In one corner, his scavenged supplies were neatly stacked, water, protein bars, tools, the remaining propane tank. You live here? The mage asked, her voice filled with disbelief as she took in the organized chaos. For now, Li Wei said. He guided her to a stool, then retrieved the first aid kit he'd looted from the campus infirmary. Let me see that arm. She hesitated, then nodded, pulling back the torn fabric of her sleeve. The wound wasn't deep, a gash from broken glass or debris, but it was bleeding steadily. Li Wei cleaned it with antiseptic, his movements methodical. The familiar routine of problem-solving, of applying known principles to achieve a desired outcome, calmed the last remnants of adrenaline shaking through his system. You're not the first, she said quietly as he bandaged the wound. Li Wei looked up. Not the first what? Person who can do, whatever that was. She gestured vaguely toward the door. The bubble thing. The science. He finished securing the bandage, his mind already analyzing this new data point. There are others. A few. I saw them, early on. Her expression darkened, memories surfacing behind her eyes. The system doesn't like them. Calls them anomalies. She spat the word like a curse. There are hunters, people in black armor. They track them down. I saw it happen, 3 days after everything went to hell. Li Wei's hands stilled. The system notification from Chapter 1 echoed in his memory, Viral Enforcement Unit dispatched. He'd assumed it was a generic response to his reality anchor usage. But if there were specialized hunters? What happened to the anomalies they caught, he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. The mage met his gaze, her eyes haunted. They don't take prisoners. Outside, through the Faraday cage's interference, a distant sound echoed, the crunch of heavy boots on rubble, moving with purpose rather than the shambling randomness of the infected. She heard it too. Her head snapped toward the door, fear returning to her features. They're coming for you, she whispered. They always find the ones who don't play by the system's rules. Li Wei looked at his lab, at the equations on the whiteboards, the half-built devices on the workbenches, the Faraday cage that had been his first true sanctuary. Then he looked at the woman before him, injured and afraid, who had seen others like him hunted down. "My name is Lin," she said, as if offering it as both introduction and warning. "And if those hunters are coming, we don't have much time." The footsteps outside grew closer, methodical, searching. Through the door's reinforced window, shadows moved in the gathering dusk, shapes too coordinated, too purposeful to be zombies. Li Wei's hand went to the reality anchor device, its battery still critically low. The solar cells would need hours of daylight to recharge it fully. Hours they might not have. He began calculating. The coordinated footsteps outside the lab door had faded into the distance, but their echo lingered in Li Wei's mind like a persistent headache. He pressed his back against the reinforced steel door, listening until the last trace of sound vanished into the ruined campus's ambient noise, the distant moans of zombies, the occasional crash of collapsing debris, the whisper of wind through broken windows. Lin sat on the floor nearby, her breathing still shallow from their escape. The makeshift bandage on her arm was already showing a faint red bloom through the fabric. In the lab's emergency lighting, her face looked pale, shadows gathering beneath her eyes where exhaustion had settled like sediment. "They're gone," Li Wei said, his voice low. "For now." He turned from the door, his gaze sweeping across the laboratory that had become both sanctuary and prison. The reality anchor device sat on his workbench, its battery indicator showing a steady red, completely depleted. It would need hours to recharge from the lab's backup solar cells, assuming the sun cooperated tomorrow. The chemical flares he'd used to distract the zombies were gone from his inventory, leaving only 3 magnesium strips and a dwindling supply of potassium permanganate. His propane torch sat with its fuel gauge hovering just above empty. "We need to fortify this place," Li Wei said, more to himself than to Lin. "The system enforcers know I'm here. They'll be back." Lin pushed herself up, wincing as her injured arm protested the movement. "What can I do?" "Inventory first." They spent the next hour cataloging every resource in the two-room laboratory. Li Wei's quantum physics equipment was mostly useless for survival: spectrometers, particle detectors, superconducting magnets that required more power than the entire campus could now provide. But scattered among the specialized instruments were treasures: copper wiring spools from old experiments, sheets of aluminum and steel used for shielding, a small but functional soldering iron with its own battery pack, rolls of electrical tape, and a toolbox containing wrenches, screwdrivers, and wire cutters. The food situation was dire. 3 protein bars remained from Li Wei's earlier scavenging, plus 2 bottles of water. Lin had been carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the fading magical energy within her. "We need more supplies," Li Wei said, staring at the pathetic collection on the workbench. "But going out again risks bringing the enforcers right to our doorstep." Lin followed his gaze. "There's a maintenance shed about 50 meters east. I saw it when I was running earlier. It might have tools, maybe even some emergency rations." Li Wei considered this. The shed would be outside the lab's immediate perimeter, but close enough that they could make a quick dash if needed. More importantly, it might contain the materials he was already envisioning in his mind's eye, a design taking shape from principles of electromagnetic theory and practical engineering. "We go together," he decided. "But quietly. And we watch for that drone you mentioned." They waited until dusk, when the fading light would provide some cover but not yet plunge the campus into complete darkness. Li Wei armed himself with the makeshift spear he'd crafted earlier, its tip sharpened from a broken lab stand. Lin carried a fire extinguisher as both weapon and tool. Its chemical contents might disrupt zombie regeneration if aimed properly. The maintenance shed stood where Lin had described, its door hanging open on one hinge. Inside, they found exactly what Li Wei had hoped for: rolls of copper mesh used for electrical grounding, sheets of galvanized steel, boxes of nuts and bolts, and, most precious of all, a working multimeter and a small generator that still had half a tank of gasoline. They worked in tense silence, loading everything they could carry into 2 canvas tool bags Lin found hanging on the wall. Li Wei's mind raced ahead, calculating weights, dimensions, electromagnetic properties. The Faraday cage concept was simple in theory: a conductive enclosure that blocks external static and non-static electric fields. But building one large enough to protect the entire lab, using scavenged materials, with the system's energy matrix constantly fluctuating in the background, that would require more than textbook knowledge. They were halfway back to the lab when the first zombie appeared. It emerged from behind a collapsed vending machine, its movements jerky but fast, system-enhanced speed, Li Wei noted automatically. Before he could react, Lin raised her good arm and muttered something under her breath. A small flame sparked to life in her palm, then sputtered out, leaving only a wisp of smoke. Magic still depleted, she whispered, her voice tight with frustration. Li Wei stepped forward, spear ready. Through his anomaly perception, he could see the zombie's energy matrix, a chaotic swirl of system-corrupted patterns that violated conservation principles. He didn't have the fuel for his propane torch, and his reality anchor was still recharging. But he remembered something from their earlier encounter. "The multimeter," he said, not taking his eyes off the approaching zombie. "Hand it to me." Lin fumbled in the tool bag, her injured arm making the motion awkward. She passed him the device just as the zombie lunged. Li Wei sidestepped, letting the creature's momentum carry it past him. As it turned, he saw the exposed wiring in its neck, probably from whatever accident or attack had turned it. Without hesitation, he jammed the multimeter's probes into the wiring, completing a circuit between 2 points that shouldn't have been connected. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the zombie convulsed, its system-enhanced movements becoming erratic, disjointed. Li Wei watched through his perception as the energy matrix flickered, trying to compensate for the sudden short circuit he'd introduced. It was a crude hack, no elegant thermodynamic cascade failure this time, but it worked. The zombie staggered, fell to its knees, and lay still. "What did you do?" Lin asked, staring at the motionless form. "Introduced a logic error," Li Wei said, retrieving his probes. "The system tries to maintain consistency across all infected entities. When I created an impossible electrical state in this one, it forced a local recalculation that, well, crashed this particular instance." He wiped the probes clean on his pants, already thinking ahead. The multimeter was now contaminated with biological material, but it still functioned. More importantly, he'd confirmed the hypothesis: the system's control over individual zombies wasn't absolute. It could be disrupted with the right kind of interference. Back in the lab, they barricaded the door with a heavy lab table and began work on the Faraday cage. Li Wei sketched designs on a whiteboard using a marker that was almost dry, explaining the principles to Lin as he worked. "The system communicates through energy fields that behave like electromagnetic radiation," he said, drawing overlapping circles and arrows. "If we can create a continuous conductive enclosure around the lab, those fields can't penetrate. It's like putting this room inside a microwave, except with the food trying not to get cooked." Lin watched, her expression shifting from skepticism to dawning understanding. "So if the system can't reach us, then its notifications stop. Its influence over this local area diminishes. And most importantly," Li Wei tapped the whiteboard for emphasis, "the enforcers lose their tracking advantage. They might know roughly where we are, but without system guidance, they'd have to search the old-fashioned way." The construction took most of the night. Li Wei measured and cut the copper mesh, while Lin used the soldering iron to join the seams, her mage's fine motor control proving surprisingly useful for delicate work despite her injury. They layered the mesh between sheets of galvanized steel, creating a sandwich of conductive materials that would, in theory, distribute any incoming energy across the entire surface rather than letting it penetrate. By dawn, they had covered 3 walls and most of the ceiling. The 4th wall, with its reinforced door and window, presented a problem: how to maintain conductivity across moving parts. Li Wei solved it by creating a brush contact system using copper strips and springs scavenged from old lab equipment. It wouldn't win any engineering awards, but it should complete the circuit when the door was closed. "Test time," Li Wei said, his voice hoarse from dust and fatigue. He connected the multimeter to various points on their makeshift cage, checking for continuity. Every seam, every joint, every connection point. Lin watched the readings, calling out numbers as he moved around the room. Her bandage had been changed twice during the night, the wound beneath still angry but no longer bleeding freely. Finally, Li Wei stepped back. "It should work. In theory. What if it doesn't?" Lin asked. "Then we've wasted precious resources and probably alerted every system entity within a kilometer that we're trying to hide from them." He didn't add what they both knew: if it failed, they were dead. The enforcers would come, and this time they wouldn't just patrol past the door. Li Wei took a deep breath and closed the lab's main electrical breaker. The emergency lights flickered off, plunging them into near darkness save for the gray dawn light filtering through the Faraday shielded window. He waited, counting seconds in his head. 1. 2. 3. Nothing happened. 4. 5. 6. Still nothing. Then, slowly, a change settled over the room. It wasn't something visible or audible, but rather a sensation, like pressure lifting from Li Wei's temples, a constant background hum he hadn't fully realized was there suddenly falling silent. Through his anomaly perception, the chaotic energy matrix that had permeated everything since the outbreak faded. Not completely, he could still sense it beyond their walls, but within the lab, it was gone. System notifications, Lin whispered. They've stopped. She was right. The constant stream of status updates, threat alerts, and skill cooldown reminders that had been part of their reality since the virus outbreak had simply vanished. The silence felt unnatural, profound. Li Wei allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, then immediately pushed it aside. The cage works. But it's only the first layer of defense. They spent the next few hours setting up basic perimeter alerts, tin cans on strings around the lab's exterior, chemical tripwires that would release foul-smelling compounds if disturbed, a simple pulley system that would drop a barricade across the door if someone tried to force it. Each defense was crude but functional, designed to buy them seconds of warning if attackers came. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the ruined campus, Li Wei stood at the window, watching through a small gap in the Faraday shielding. The world outside looked the same, collapsed buildings, wandering zombies, the occasional distant flash of what might have been magic or gunfire. But in here, for the first time since awakening in this nightmare, he felt something approaching safety. Then he saw it. A drone, sleek and black, marked with glowing system symbols along its fuselage. It flew in a precise grid pattern about 20 meters above ground level, methodically scanning the area. As Li Wei watched, it paused directly above the lab, hovering as if confused. Its sensors swept back and forth, but whatever it was looking for, the Faraday cage seemed to be hiding it. For a long minute, the drone remained stationary. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it darted away to the east, disappearing behind the remains of the campus library. Lin joined him at the window. Was that an enforcer scout? Li Wei finished. They know we're here. And now they know something's blocking their scans. He didn't say what they both were thinking, the next visit wouldn't be from a drone. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the lab's metal roof with a sound like distant footsteps approaching. The morning light filtered through the Faraday cage's makeshift windows, casting geometric shadows across the lab's concrete floor. Li Wei sat hunched over his microscope, the cold metal pressing against his forehead as he adjusted the focus knob with trembling fingers. A piece of zombie tissue, harvested from yesterday's disabled specimen, rested on the slide, its cellular structure illuminated in stark detail. Through his anomaly perception, the tissue wasn't just decaying flesh. It pulsed with the system's energy matrix, a latticework of shimmering blue threads woven through every cell. The viral code manifested as repeating fractal patterns, like corrupted computer code rendered in 3 dimensions. Li Wei's nose had stopped bleeding hours ago, but the phantom ache behind his eyes remained, a constant reminder of the mental strain required to maintain this dual vision. See here, he murmured, more to himself than to Lin who was sorting scavenged supplies nearby. The regeneration pathways follow Fibonacci sequences, but there's a discontinuity at the 7th iteration. A mathematical flaw. He sketched in his notebook, graphite scratching against paper. The diagrams showed energy flows, thermodynamic equations, and chemical bonding patterns. The system's attempt to maintain biological functions while spreading its viral code created vulnerabilities, points where the matrix couldn't reconcile physical laws with programmed instructions. If I inject a contradictory instruction at the moment of impact, Li Wei whispered, his breath fogging the microscope's eyepiece, the system would have to process 2 mutually exclusive commands simultaneously. Under thermodynamic constraints, it should cascade into a logic error. The theory felt solid in his mind, a beautiful intersection of quantum computing principles and biological systems. But theory meant nothing without testing. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. The Faraday cage hummed with residual energy, its copper mesh walls absorbing any stray system signals. For the first time since the outbreak, the constant pressure of the system's presence had lifted from his consciousness. No status notifications, no skill prompts, no invasive energy scans. Just silence. Lin approached, her footsteps careful on the debris-strewn floor. She carried a canvas bag that clinked with metallic sounds. Found these in the campus security office, she said, her voice still carrying the exhaustion of their previous encounters. The door was jammed, but your chemical solvent worked on the lock. She emptied the bag onto the workbench. 3 disassembled handguns lay among the components, a 9mm pistol missing its slide, a revolver with a cracked cylinder, and what looked like a police-issue firearm with its barrel bent. Alongside them were boxes of ammunition, their brass casings tarnished but intact. More valuable were the chemical containers, small vials labeled with university stock numbers, their contents ranging from reactive metals to organic catalysts. Li Wei picked up a vial of powdered magnesium, turning it in the light. This could work as the reactive component, combined with a copper-based catalyst. His mind raced through chemical equations. The reaction would need to be exothermic but controlled, releasing energy in a precise pattern that mimicked the system's own energy signatures. For the next 3 hours, they worked in focused silence. Li Wei disassembled the functional ammunition, carefully prying bullets from their casings. His hands moved with the practiced precision of a laboratory technician, each motion economical and deliberate. Lin sorted chemicals according to his instructions, her mage training giving her an intuitive understanding of energy patterns even if she couldn't perceive the matrix directly. The system's viral code operates on quantum entangled principles, Li Wei explained as he measured chemicals into a ceramic crucible. But it's implemented through biochemical pathways. That's the weakness, the translation layer between quantum instructions and cellular execution. He heated the mixture over a Bunsen burner, the blue flame casting dancing shadows. The chemicals melted into a silvery paste that shimmered with unnatural light. Through his anomaly sight, the substance emitted energy patterns that precisely mirrored the discontinuities he'd observed in the zombie tissue. Now for the delivery system, Li Wei said, his voice tight with concentration. Using fine-tipped tools, he coated each bullet with the reactive compound. The process was painstaking. Too thick a coating would prevent proper ballistic performance, too thin would fail to deliver sufficient chemical payload. He worked through 12 rounds before his hands began to shake from exhaustion and mental strain. Lin watched, her expression a mixture of fascination and apprehension. "You're rewriting reality with chemistry," she said softly. "The system enforcers, they use magic as a blunt instrument. Fireballs, lightning, force fields. But this." She gestured at the coated bullets. "This is surgical." "It's physics," Li Wei corrected, though without his earlier pedantic tone. "The system pretends to be magic, but it operates within physical constraints. It just cheats." He loaded 3 of the modified rounds into the least damaged handgun, a semi-automatic pistol that had survived with only minor corrosion. The weight felt unfamiliar in his hand. He'd never fired a gun before the outbreak. But the principles were simple enough: point, pull trigger, let chemistry and physics do the rest. "We need to test it," he said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. They ventured outside the Faraday cage's protection, moving through the ruined campus with deliberate caution. The system's presence returned immediately, a psychic pressure that made Li Wei's vision swim. Status notifications flickered at the edge of his perception, trying to categorize him, analyze him, control him. He pushed them aside through sheer force of will. In the quad where he'd first encountered the zombies, a single shambler remained. It was one of the standard models, humanoid, system-enhanced regeneration active, its movements jerky but purposeful. Through his anomaly sight, Li Wei could see the energy matrix glowing brightly within it, the viral code replicating through every cell. He took position behind a collapsed concrete planter, Lin crouching beside him. "The bullet needs to penetrate deep enough for the coating to react with bodily fluids," he whispered. "Center mass, ideally." His hands were steady as he aimed. The pistol's sights aligned with the zombie's torso. He breathed out, slowly, and pulled the trigger. The report was louder than he expected, the recoil jarring his wrist. The bullet struck true, embedding itself in the zombie's chest. For a moment, nothing happened. The zombie staggered but continued its shambling approach, the wound already beginning to close through system-enhanced regeneration. Then the energy matrix flickered. Through his anomaly perception, Li Wei watched as the reactive compound dispersed through the zombie's circulatory system. The chemicals sought out the viral code's mathematical discontinuities, bonding with the energy patterns at the quantum level. Where they made contact, contradictions propagated through the matrix. The zombie froze, its body seizing as conflicting instructions tore through its system functions. Regenerate the wound. Delete the foreign substance. Maintain cellular integrity. Process the chemical reaction. Each command contradicted another, creating recursive logic loops that the system couldn't resolve. Thermodynamic cascade failure began at the molecular level. The energy sustaining the zombie's unnatural biology dissipated as heat, steam rising from its skin in visible plumes. The flesh around the bullet wound didn't just fail to regenerate, it disintegrated, cells breaking down into their component proteins and amino acids. The process spread outward from the impact site, a wave of dissolution that left only inert organic matter in its wake. 30 seconds after being shot, the zombie collapsed into a heap of gray sludge. No movement. No regeneration. No system energy signatures. Li Wei lowered the pistol, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The mental effort of maintaining his anomaly perception through the entire event had brought fresh blood trickling from his nose. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, leaving a crimson smear. It worked, Lin breathed, her eyes wide. You killed it. Really killed it. Disabled its system functions, Li Wei corrected automatically, though even he could hear the awe in his own voice. The biological components were already dead. I just turned off the puppet strings. They returned to the lab in silence, the weight of what they'd accomplished hanging between them. Inside the Faraday cage's protective embrace, Li Wei immediately began coating more bullets. His movements were faster now, more confident. He used the remaining chemicals efficiently, measuring exact proportions for maximum effect. By the time he finished, they had 23 logic error bullets, a small arsenal against the undead. Lin organized them into magazines while Li Wei documented the chemical formula in his notebook. Every detail mattered: ratios, reaction temperatures, application methods. This knowledge was their only advantage in a world where magic had become mundane. As dusk settled over the ruined campus, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they heard it. The familiar whine of the system-marked drone returned, louder this time. It circled above the Faraday cage, its sensors undoubtedly detecting the complete absence of system signals from within. Through a gap in the window covering, Li Wei watched as it hovered, a black teardrop shape with glowing red lenses where eyes should be. Then came the shouts. Distant at first, but growing closer. Human voices, but distorted, filtered through helmets or vocal modulators. They called coordinates to each other in crisp, military precision. The sound of heavy boots on pavement echoed through the quiet evening. Lin froze, a magazine of logic error bullets half-loaded in her hands. They're here, she whispered. Li Wei moved to the lab's reinforced door, peering through the viewing slot he'd installed. In the gathering twilight, he saw figures approaching. 3 of them, clad in black armor that seemed to drink the fading light. System enforcers. Their movements were too coordinated, too fluid to be entirely human. Energy crackled around their gauntlets, visible manifestations of the system's power. They stopped at the edge of the quad, just beyond the Faraday cage's effective radius. One pointed directly at the lab, its gesture unmistakable. They knew exactly where Li Wei was hiding. And they were coming. The footsteps that had haunted Li Wei's thoughts for days finally materialized into solid forms at the edge of his makeshift perimeter. 2 figures in matte black armor stood at the boundary where the Faraday cage's influence began to disrupt the system's energy matrix. Their armor wasn't mere plating, it flowed like liquid metal in places, shimmering with faint violet energy patterns that Li Wei recognized as system-enforced reinforcement protocols. Lin tensed beside him, her fingers curling around the rusted pipe she'd been using as a makeshift staff. They're here, she whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the Faraday cage's improvised power source. Li Wei watched through a narrow gap in the lab's reinforced window. The enforcers moved with unnatural grace, their steps synchronized in a way that spoke of shared tactical data streams. One stood slightly taller, his armor marked with silver glyphs along the shoulder pauldrons. The other carried an energy blade that crackled with blue-white plasma, its containment field visibly distorting the air around it. Anomaly designation Li Wei, the taller enforcer called out, his voice filtered through a helmet modulator that gave it a metallic, hollow quality. Your interference with local system protocols has been logged. Surrender for processing, and your companion may be granted standard survivor status. Lin stepped forward before Li Wei could stop her. We're just trying to survive. The system was supposed to help humanity, not turn us into hunters and hunted. Her voice shook with equal parts fear and defiance. The enforcer with the energy blade tilted his head, a gesture that seemed almost curious. The system maintains order. Anomalies introduce chaos variables that threaten the stabilization process. This is not negotiation. Li Wei felt the familiar pressure building behind his eyes, the mental strain of constantly analyzing the energy matrices around him. He could see the enforcer's armor as more than physical protection. Each plate pulsed with system energy, drawing power from the same viral matrix that enhanced the zombies. But here, at the edge of his Faraday cage, those connections flickered like bad reception. Their enhancements are weaker within our field, he murmured to Lin. But not disabled completely. The taller enforcer raised a hand. Final warning. Surrender or be. Lin didn't let him finish. She channeled what little magical energy remained in her depleted reserves, sending a weak but precise gust of wind that kicked up dust and debris toward the enforcers' faces. It was a distraction, not an attack, and it worked perfectly. Both enforcers reacted with superhuman speed, but their movements weren't as fluid as they should have been. The Faraday cage was doing its work, disrupting the system's signals that coordinated their enhanced reflexes. Still, they were fast enough. The energy blade wielder lunged forward, his weapon carving through the air toward Lin. Li Wei didn't think, he acted. His hand found the modified pistol at his belt, fingers closing around the grip that still felt unfamiliar after a lifetime spent holding scientific instruments rather than weapons. He fired. The logic error bullet left the barrel with a sharper crack than conventional ammunition. Li Wei had engineered the propellant himself, using chemical compounds scavenged from the campus chemistry lab. The bullet itself was coated with the reactive mixture he'd spent hours perfecting, a compound designed not to pierce armor, but to introduce mathematical contradictions into any system-linked material it contacted. It struck the enforcer's chest plate with a sound like shattering crystal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then violet energy lines spiderwebbed across the black armor, flickering erratically. The enforcer staggered, his energy blade sputtering as conflicting system commands fought for dominance within his armor's matrix. But the damage wasn't fatal, the armor's physical integrity held, and after 3 seconds of chaotic flickering, the energy pattern stabilized, though noticeably dimmer. Interesting, the taller enforcer said, his modulated voice carrying what might have been genuine curiosity. You've weaponized local rule violations. Li Wei fired again, this time aiming for the joint at the enforcer's knee. The bullet struck true, and this time the effect was more pronounced. The enforcer's leg buckled as the armor's servos received contradictory movement commands, forward and backward simultaneously. He went down on one knee, but his companion was already moving. The second enforcer abandoned his malfunctioning energy blade, drawing a conventional-looking pistol that Li Wei recognized as military issue. 3 rounds punched through the lab's already damaged exterior wall, forcing Li Wei and Lin to dive behind a reinforced workbench. Their armor adapts, Li Wei said, breathing heavily. The mental strain was becoming physical now, a sharp pain behind his eyes that threatened to blossom into another nosebleed. The logic errors work, but their systems have redundancy protocols. We need something more fundamental. Lin peered over the workbench. More fundamental than breaking their computers with math? Thermodynamics, Li Wei said, the idea forming even as he spoke. Their armor uses system energy for enhancement, but it still has to dissipate heat. If we overwhelm the cooling systems. He crawled toward the far wall where he'd stored the last of their scavenged supplies. The propane torch was there, its tank depressingly light when he lifted it. Maybe a quarter full, if he was optimistic. Enough for one good attempt. The enforcers were advancing now, moving more cautiously but with undeniable purpose. The one with the damaged leg armor moved with a slight limp, but both were closing the distance to the lab's main entrance. Li Wei made his decision. Lin, when I give the signal, hit them with everything you've got left. Don't worry about damage, just make them focus on you. What are you going to do? Apply some basic physics. He waited until the enforcers were 10 feet from the door, close enough that the Faraday cage's effect would be maximal, disrupting their system links to the point where reaction times would be merely human rather than superhuman. Close enough that he wouldn't miss. Now, he shouted. Lin stood, both hands extended. She didn't have enough energy for fireballs or lightning, but she'd been practicing with air manipulation since they'd fortified the lab. A concentrated blast of wind shot from her palms, not strong enough to knock the enforcers over, but enough to make them brace themselves, their attention fully on her. Li Wei moved. He came around the side of the workbench, propane torch already lit with a blue-white flame. The enforcer with the pistol saw him first, bringing his weapon to bear, but Li Wei was already within arm's reach. He didn't aim for the chest plate or helmet, he went for the joints. The elbow first, where flexible armor allowed movement but had to maintain system connectivity. The torch flame, focused to a needle point by the modified nozzle, played across the joint for exactly 2 seconds. At first, nothing happened. Then the armor began to glow, not with system energy, but with actual heat. Red-orange spots appeared where the flame had concentrated, spreading as the armor's internal cooling systems failed to compensate. The enforcer screamed, a raw, human sound that cut through his helmet's modulator. He dropped the pistol, clawing at his arm as the armor heated to the point of burning through the undersuit. Li Wei pivoted, aiming for the second enforcer's knee joint, the same one he'd hit with the logic error bullet. The damaged systems couldn't handle the thermal stress. With a sound like popping rivets, the armor plate buckled, superheated metal warping and locking the joint in place. The enforcer collapsed, unable to stand. For a moment, both enforcers were disabled, one with an arm locked in glowing, half-melted armor, the other with a fused knee joint. The taller one, the one who had done all the talking, looked up at Li Wei. Through his damaged helmet visor, Li Wei could see human eyes, bloodshot, pained, but still intelligent. "This changes nothing," the enforcer gasped. "The system will recalibrate. There are always more enforcers. Then we'll be ready," Li Wei said, his voice steadier than he felt. The enforcers retreated, dragging themselves backward out of the Faraday cage's influence. As they crossed the boundary, their armor systems visibly reconnected to the broader system matrix, but the physical damage remained. They wouldn't be returning today. Lin slumped against the workbench, breathing heavily. "That was closer than I'd like." Li Wei didn't answer immediately. His attention was on the ground where the enforcers had been. Something had fallen during the struggle, a small, rectangular device about the size of a smartphone, but made of the same matte black material as the enforcer's armor. A comm device. He picked it up carefully. The surface was warm to the touch, and faint energy patterns still danced across its surface. As he watched, the device crackled to life, emitting a burst of static followed by a voice that was neither human nor modulated. It was cold, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Report status on Anomaly Li Wei containment," the voice said. Then, without waiting for a response that wouldn't come from captured enforcers, it continued. "Local interference patterns indicate advanced sanctuary development. Authorization granted for full assault protocol. Viral warden will lead detachment in 72 hours. Prepare systemic purge." The message repeated once, then the device went dark. Lin stared at the silent comm device, then at Li Wei. 3 days, she whispered. Li Wei turned the device over in his hands, his mind already working through variables, probabilities, and the harsh realities of their situation. The Faraday cage had worked against 2 enforcers. Against a full detachment led by whatever a viral warden was. They had 72 hours to find out. The morning light filtered through the lab's grimy windows, casting long shadows across the Faraday cage's copper mesh walls. Li Wei stared at the system enforcer comm device on his workbench, its screen displaying a countdown, 68 hours, 42 minutes remaining. The numbers seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, each passing second tightening the noose around their sanctuary. "We need fuel," Li Wei said, his voice raspy from lack of sleep. "And more metals. The Faraday cage held against those enforcers, but Viral Warden will bring more. Stronger ones." Lin leaned against the wall, her face pale beneath the dirt smudges. The mage's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the makeshift bandage on her arm, a remnant from yesterday's confrontation. "The industrial park," she suggested. 3 kilometers northeast. Before the outbreak, it had chemical storage, machine shops. She trailed off, her eyes distant. "My brother worked at one of the factories." Li Wei nodded, already mentally cataloging what they needed. Propane for the torch, copper for reinforcing the cage, sulfuric acid if they could find it, anything that could disrupt biological systems through chemistry rather than magic. He checked the reality anchor device, its indicator glowed a steady blue, fully recharged after yesterday's ordeal. 23 logic error bullets remained in the makeshift bandolier, each one a precious resource they couldn't replace without rare chemicals they no longer possessed. They moved through the ruined campus with practiced silence. The quad where Li Wei had tested his bullets yesterday now held the twisted remains of the zombie he'd disabled, its body frozen in a pose of violent contradiction, muscles pulled in opposing directions by the logic errors he'd injected. The air smelled of ozone and decay, a scent that had become as familiar as the stale protein bars they rationed. The industrial park emerged from the morning haze like a graveyard of human industry. Rusting warehouses stretched along cracked asphalt roads, their windows shattered, their loading docks choked with debris. A faded sign for Chang Chemical Solutions hung askew from one building, its letters partially obscured by what looked like dried blood. "There," Lin whispered, pointing to a cluster of buildings with intact roofs. "The machine shop should have fuel tanks. And the chemical storage." She didn't finish the thought. They had just reached the first warehouse when voices echoed from within. Human voices. Li Wei motioned for silence, pressing against the corrugated metal wall. Through a gap in the loading bay door, he saw movement, 5 figures moving cautiously between stacks of crates. The leader was a broad-shouldered man wearing scavenged riot gear, a makeshift axe strapped to his back. His movements had the economical precision of someone who'd survived through brute force rather than system-granted magic. Zhang, Lin breathed beside him. He was campus security before everything. Before Li Wei could respond, the warehouse door creaked open. The man, Zhang, stood framed in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as they took in Li Wei's lab coat, the reality anchor device strapped to his belt, the bandolier of oddly colored bullets. Lin, Zhang said, his voice gravelly. I heard you'd thrown in with one of them. Anomalies. He spat the last word like a curse. You know what the enforcers do to people who help anomalies? We're not helping the system, Li Wei said, stepping forward. We're fighting it. Zhang's laugh was harsh, humorless. With what? Your fancy gadgets. I've seen what happens to people who try that. The system burns them out from the inside. Leaves them as empty husks. He gestured to the 3 others behind him, 2 women and a younger man, all armed with scavenged weapons, all wearing the haunted expressions of people who'd watched their world die. We survive by the rules. Warrior class gives me strength. Hunter class gives Mahir sharp eyes. He nodded to one of the women, who held a compound bow with practiced ease. You want to break the rules. That's how you get dead. Li Wei felt the familiar pressure building behind his eyes, the strain of constantly perceiving the system's energy matrix. He could see it now, faint golden threads weaving through Zhang's body, through the others, connecting them to the same viral network that animated the zombies. But where the zombies' connections were chaotic, screaming with contradictory instructions, Zhang's were ordered, disciplined. The system had made him a tool, and he didn't even know it. We have a safe zone, Li Wei said. A place where the system can't reach. Where you don't have to rely on borrowed power that can be taken away. Before Zhang could respond, the sound came, a wet, tearing noise from deep within the warehouse, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of dragging feet. Lots of feet. Zombies, Mei whispered, knocking an arrow. They must have followed us in. Zhang cursed, hefting his axe. Back door. Now. But as they turned, more shadows emerged from between the chemical drums at the rear of the warehouse. They were surrounded. The zombies moved with the jerky, efficient motion of system-enhanced predators. 12 of them, maybe more, their eyes glowing with the same golden energy Li Wei saw in the Matrix. One, larger than the others, with arms that ended in bone-like blades, let out a guttural roar that vibrated through the metal shelves. Form up. Zhang barked, his warrior-class instincts taking over. His muscles visibly swelled, the system threads in his body glowing brighter as he channeled whatever passed for mana in this broken world. Li Wei's mind raced. 12 zombies. 23 bullets. Even if every shot found its mark, which it wouldn't, not in the chaos of close quarters, they'd be overrun. He glanced at the chemical drums lining the walls. Faded hazard symbols, corrosive materials, flammable liquids. His eyes traced the pipes overhead, the drainage grates in the floor. Lin, he said quietly. The reality anchor. Maximum radius. She nodded, understanding. As Zhang and his group braced for the first charge, Lin pulled the device from Li Wei's belt. Her fingers danced across the controls, not with magical finesse, but with the precise movements Li Wei had taught her, based on electromagnetic field calculations rather than incantations. The device hummed to life. A sphere of silent nullity expanded from it, 10 meters in radius. Where it passed, the golden threads in the zombies' bodies flickered, dimmed. The system-enhanced speed faltered, their movements became sluggish, uncoordinated. Zhang's own enhancements wavered, he stumbled, the sudden loss of system support like having a limb go numb. What did you do? He snarled, but Li Wei was already moving. Acid traps, he said, more to himself than anyone. The drainage grates, if we can funnel them. He pointed to the largest chemical drum. Sulfuric acid. Still sealed. Mei fired an arrow. It took a zombie in the throat, but the creature kept coming, the wound already knitting itself together. System-enhanced regeneration. Without the logic error bullets, they couldn't make it stick. Li Wei grabbed a length of pipe from a broken shelving unit. Zhang. The drum. Tip it toward the center drain. He didn't wait to see if the warrior would obey. Instead, he slammed the pipe into the drum's support bracket. Metal screeched. For a heartbeat, Zhang hesitated. His eyes darted from Li Wei to the approaching zombies to his own people, who were falling back under the relentless advance. Then he cursed again, a creative string of profanity that would have made a sailor blush, and slammed his shoulder into the drum. 1,000 liters of concentrated sulfuric acid sloshed, then poured. It hit the concrete floor with a hiss that rose to a scream, eating through the surface like paper. The smell was immediate and overwhelming, acrid, burning, the scent of chemistry unleashed without restraint. Back! Li Wei shouted, pulling Lin with him. The fumes, he didn't finish. One of Zhang's people, the younger man, wasn't fast enough. A zombie grabbed his leg, dragging him toward the spreading acid pool. Li Wei didn't think. He raised his pistol, aimed not at the zombie but at the chemical drum beside it. One of his precious logic error bullets. He fired. The bullet struck the drum seam. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the reactive compound coating the bullet interacted with the drum's metal, with the residual chemicals inside. The system threads in the area, already weakened by the reality anchor, shivered. Contradictory instructions cascaded, preserve structural integrity versus allow chemical reaction versus maintain viral cohesion. The drum ruptured. Not with an explosion, but with a wet, tearing sound as reality itself seemed to hesitate. More acid joined the pool, spreading toward the central drain. Zombies caught in the flow didn't scream, their vocal cords were already too damaged, but their bodies melted, the system's regeneration unable to cope with thermodynamics on this scale. Flesh sloughed from bone, bone itself dissolved into slurry that swirled toward the drain. Zhang stared, his axe hanging forgotten at his side. You used science. The words were barely audible over the hissing acid. Not magic. Not system skills. Physics, Li Wei corrected, his nose bleeding again. The strain of maintaining perception while the reality anchor worked was like trying to solve differential equations during an earthquake. Chemistry. The system tries to overwrite them, but it can't. Not completely. There are always cracks. It took 20 minutes for the acid to finish its work. 20 minutes of watching zombies dissolve, of breathing air that burned their lungs even from a distance. When it was done, the warehouse floor was a scarred, pitted mess, the central drain clogged with unrecognizable organic matter. The smell would linger for days. Zhang approached Li Wei slowly, his warrior-enhanced strength returned now that Lin had deactivated the reality anchor. Your safe zone, he said. It really blocks the system. Completely, Li Wei said, wiping blood from his upper lip. Faraday cage based on electromagnetic principles. The system's just energy. Structured, malicious energy, but still energy. Block the signal, and... He gestured to the melted zombies. Mei lowered her bow. The younger man, his name was Xiao, Li Wei learned, limped over, his leg bandaged where the zombie had grabbed him. We've been hiding, Xiao said quietly. Moving from place to place. The enforcers, they're rounding people up. Putting them in camps. Why? Lin asked. Zhang's face darkened. To feed the hordes, he said. I've seen it. There's one enforcer, taller than the others, wears armor that looks like it grew from his skin. He doesn't just command zombies. He directs them. Like a general. Li Wei's blood went cold. Viral warden. Zhang nodded. That's what the others call him. He's been gathering forces west of the river. Thousands of zombies. And he's not just controlling them, he's changing them. Making them stronger. Faster. He met Li Wei's eyes. 3 days ago, he passed through here. Heading east. Toward the university. The implication hung in the acid-tainted air. Li Wei's sanctuary. The Faraday cage. The reality anchor. All of it had drawn attention they couldn't afford. Come with us, Li Wei said. To the sanctuary. We have defenses. We have a plan. Zhang looked at his people, at Mei with her bow, at Xiao limping, at the other woman, Ling, she said her name was, who hadn't spoken but whose eyes held a desperate hope. What's the plan? He asked finally. Survive, Li Wei said. And then fight back. Not with magic the system gives us. With science it can't understand. They spent the next hour scavenging what they could, propane tanks from the machine shop, copper wiring from electrical panels, a sealed container of hydrochloric acid that Li Wei handled with reverent care. Each item added weight to their packs, but also to their chances. As they prepared to leave, Zhang pulled Li Wei aside. "The warden," he said quietly. "I saw what he did to a group of survivors who tried to fight. He didn't just kill them. He repurposed them. Turned them into something else. Not zombies. Something worse." "How many?" Li Wei asked. "Enough to darken the sky when they march," Zhang said. "And he's coming. Soon." They walked back toward the university in silence, the industrial park fading behind them. The sun was high now, beating down on the broken world. Li Wei's mind raced with calculations, reinforcement schedules for the Faraday cage, distribution of logic error bullets, chemical traps they could set. But beneath the equations, a colder thought persisted. Viral Warden wasn't just another enforcer. He was evolution. The system learning, adapting. And in 3 days, no, 67 hours now, he would bring everything he had learned to their doorstep. The sanctuary's copper mesh walls gleamed in the distance, a fragile bastion against the coming storm. Li Wei adjusted the pack on his shoulders, feeling the weight of the acid, the fuel, the metals. The weight of the people now following him. Zhang walked beside him, his axe resting on his shoulder, his eyes constantly scanning the ruins. "When he comes," Zhang said without looking at Li Wei, "I want to be the one who faces him. Warrior 2, whatever he is." "You might get your wish," Li Wei said. "But we'll face him together. Science and strength. Both are just different ways of understanding the world." Zhang grunted, which might have been agreement. Or might not have been. Ahead, the sanctuary waited. And beyond it, somewhere to the west, an army was gathering. The sanctuary felt different with 10 people crammed into what had been Li Wei's solitary refuge for days. The air hummed with tension thicker than the ozone sent from the Faraday cage's copper wiring. Zhang stood near the entrance, his broad shoulders tense as he watched Lin demonstrate the reality anchor's principles to Mei, who kept glancing at her compound bow as if questioning why she needed physics lessons. Li Wei wiped sweat from his brow, the metallic taste of blood still lingering from another nosebleed during the journey back. The propane tanks they'd scavenged sat in a corner, their weight a temporary comfort against the 72-hour countdown ticking in his mind. He could see the system's energy matrix flickering at the edges of his perception, a shimmering lattice of corrupted data that pulsed with the rhythm of the viral code spreading through the world. "We need to establish roles," Zhang said, his voice cutting through the murmured conversations. "Magic users should handle defense. My people know how to fight." Lin straightened, her injured leg protesting the movement. "Magic depletes. The system feeds on it. Li Wei's methods don't." "And what are his methods?" Zhang gestured at the workbench where logic error bullets gleamed under the lab lights. "Tricks with chemicals. Mirrors." Li Wei stepped forward, the weight of 22 remaining bullets in his pocket a tangible reminder of their limited resources. "They're not tricks. The system operates on flawed thermodynamics. Every magical enhancement creates entropy that can be exploited." He picked up a scrap of copper wire, its surface reflecting the pale glow of the energy matrix only he could see. "Your warrior class gives you enhanced strength by drawing from the system's energy reservoir. But that reservoir has limits, mathematical discontinuities in the viral code." Xiao groaned from where he lay on a makeshift cot, his bandages stained with dried blood from the warehouse ambush. Ling stood silently beside him, her eyes tracking every movement in the room. The silent member of Zhang's group hadn't spoken since their arrival, but Li Wei noticed how her hands kept flexing as if ready to cast a spell she no longer possessed. "Show me," Zhang said, crossing his arms. "Not theories. Something that works." Li Wei nodded, his mind already calculating the energy requirements. He moved to the workbench where scavenged gun parts lay disassembled, the fruits of Lin's earlier scavenging. The automated turret design had been forming in his mind since he first saw the system enforcer's armor. Using the propane torch's remaining fuel would be risky, but necessary. "Mei, your compound bow uses kinetic energy transfer," Li Wei said as he began assembling the turret's mounting bracket. "The system enhances that through magical amplification. But what if we removed the system from the equation entirely?" He connected copper wiring to a salvaged motor, his fingers moving with the precision of years in a laboratory. The Faraday cage hummed around them, its electromagnetic field creating a bubble where the system's influence weakened. In that bubble, Li Wei could see the energy matrix fraying at the edges, mathematical imperfections that looked like cracks in reality itself. Watch, he said, loading one of the logic error bullets into the turret's modified chamber. Outside the sanctuary's reinforced door, a lone zombie shambled past, one of the slower ones that hadn't yet developed the enhanced regeneration. Li Wei aimed the turret through a narrow firing port, his mind calculating trajectories, wind resistance, and the chemical reaction that would occur upon impact. The bullet contained a reactive compound designed to exploit the fractal patterns he'd observed in zombie tissue under the microscope. He fired. The sound was different from a normal gunshot, a sharp crack followed by a sizzling hiss. The bullet struck the zombie's shoulder, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the system energy around the creature began to flicker erratically. Li Wei could see the logic errors propagating through the viral code, creating contradictory instructions that cascaded into thermodynamic failure. The zombie's flesh turned gray and brittle, crumbling like ash in the wind. Silence filled the sanctuary. "One bullet," Zhang said slowly. "You have how many?" 22, Li Wei admitted. "The chemicals required are rare. We used the last of them. And against a horde. That's why we need more than bullets." Li Wei turned back to the workbench, his mind already racing through possibilities. The hydrochloric acid they'd scavenged could be used to create corrosive traps, but environmental damage would be significant. The copper wiring could amplify the Faraday cage's effect, but they needed more power sources. Every solution created new problems, each requiring careful calculation of energy budgets and material constraints. Over the next several hours, Li Wei worked while teaching. He showed Zhang how to position mirrors to reflect system energy attacks, not through magic, but through basic optics. The energy blades used by system enforcers operated on coherent light patterns that could be redirected with properly angled surfaces. He demonstrated using sound waves from a salvaged speaker system to disrupt zombie coordination, explaining how the viral code relied on harmonic frequencies for hive-mind communication. Constant calibration required, Li Wei warned as he adjusted the speaker's frequency. The system adapts. What works now might not work in an hour. His head throbbed with the strain of maintaining multiple calculations simultaneously. The energy matrix shimmered at the edge of his vision, its fractal patterns shifting in response to their preparations. Each adjustment to the Faraday cage required recalculating electromagnetic field strengths. Each logic error bullet represented a unique chemical equation that had to remain stable until impact. Lin worked beside him, her knowledge of magical classes providing crucial insights. System enforcers draw power from local nodes, she explained to Zhang's group. Like cellular towers for the virus. Li Wei's Faraday cage disrupts that connection, but only within its radius. And outside? Mei asked, her fingers tracing the string of her bow. Outside, they're nearly unstoppable, Lin admitted. Unless we can hack the nodes themselves. Li Wei paused, a new calculation forming in his mind. The comm device they'd taken from the system enforcer, could it be reverse engineered to locate nearby nodes? The risk was enormous. Attempting to hack a system node directly might alert Viral Warden to their exact capabilities. But the alternative was waiting for the assault to come to them. As dusk approached, tensions surfaced in practical ways. Zhang's warriors wanted to fortify the perimeter with barricades that would channel zombies into kill zones. Lin argued for more subtle defenses that exploited system weaknesses. Zhao's injuries required medical attention they couldn't provide, and his occasional groans reminded everyone of their vulnerability. "We need to prioritize," Zhang said during a tense meeting around the workbench. "Your science takes time to set up. My people can fight now." "Fighting without understanding what you're fighting is suicide," Li Wei countered, his voice calm despite the headache building behind his eyes. "The zombies aren't mindless. They're extensions of the system, each one a processing unit in a distributed network. Kill one, and the system reallocates resources to the others." He drew a diagram on a scrap of paper, showing the fractal connections he'd observed in the energy matrix. "See these patterns? They're not random. They're computational. The system is using infected biomass as living processors. That's why regeneration happens, it's not healing, it's data reconstruction." Mei leaned closer, her hunter's instincts recognizing patterns in the drawing. "Like tracking prey through the forest. You learn their routes." "Exactly. And we can disrupt those routes." Li Wei pointed to the speaker system. "Sound waves at specific frequencies interfere with the data transmission. Mirrors scatter the energy signals. The logic error bullets introduce corrupted code that spreads through the network." Zhang studied the diagram, his warrior's mind grappling with concepts far removed from swords and shields. You're saying we're not fighting monsters. We're fighting mathematics. Mathematics made flesh through flawed physics, Li Wei corrected. The system virus tried to impose magical rules on a universe that operates on scientific principles. The result is instability, cracks we can exploit. They worked through the night, fortifying the sanctuary's perimeter. Li Wei positioned mirrors at strategic angles, calculating reflection paths that would deflect energy attacks. He calibrated the speaker system to emit disruptive frequencies, though the constant adjustments drained his mental energy until dark spots danced at the edge of his vision. The Faraday cage required reinforcement with additional copper wiring, a tedious process that left his hands raw and bleeding. By dawn, the sanctuary had transformed. Automated turrets covered every approach, though they held only 6 of the precious logic error bullets. Li Wei couldn't risk more on automated systems that might misfire. Acid traps marked potential breach points, their containers carefully labeled to prevent accidents. The reality anchor hummed at the center of the room, its field now extended to cover the entire building through careful alignment of conductive materials. Li Wei stood at the main entrance, watching the sunrise paint the ruined campus in shades of orange and gray. The energy matrix shimmered across the landscape, a ghostly overlay of corruption spreading through the world. Somewhere out there, Viral Warden was gathering forces. Somewhere out there, a clock was counting down. Lin joined him, her movement stiff from her injured leg. They're starting to understand, she said quietly. Zhang asked me how the reality anchor affects magical regeneration rates. What did you tell him? The truth. That magic draws from the same source that powers the zombies. In here, that source is weakened. She paused. He didn't like it. Warriors pride themselves on their endurance. Pride won't stop system-enhanced blades, Li Wei said, his eyes scanning the horizon. The calculations never stopped in his mind, energy budgets, material constraints, probability assessments. 72 hours had become less than 48. Every resource was accounted for, every defense plotted on mental maps annotated with risk factors and failure points. Inside, Mei practiced with her bow in the limited space, her arrows striking targets marked with system energy patterns Li Wei had drawn. Zhang drilled his warriors in formations that could pivot from magical to scientific defenses as needed. Xiao slept fitfully, his breathing labored. Ling watched everything, her silent observation more unnerving than any shouted command. Then the scout returned. It was one of Zhang's people, a young man named Feng whom Li Wei hadn't properly met. He stumbled through the door, his clothes torn and face pale with exhaustion. Horde, he gasped, leaning against the wall. A kilometer east. Hundreds of them. Zhang was at his side immediately. Formations. Leaders. Gathering point. Foam swallowed, his throat working. There's something leading them. Bigger than any zombie I've seen. It has crystals growing from its flesh. Glowing ones. Li Wei felt the calculations in his mind shift, variables rearranging themselves around this new data point. Crystals suggested system energy crystallization, mutation that could mean enhanced abilities or new vulnerabilities. The energy matrix around such a creature would be denser, more complex. Did it see you? Zhang asked. Foam shook his head. I kept my distance. Used the rubble for cover. But they're definitely gathering. And they're not just shambling. They're organizing. Li Wei moved to the workbench, his hands already reaching for the comm device. If the zombies were organizing, they were receiving coordinated instructions. That meant either Viral Warden was directing them remotely, or the mutated boss had command capabilities. Either way, the assault had begun before the 72 hours were up. We need to recalibrate everything, he said, his voice calm despite the cold dread settling in his stomach. Sound frequencies for crowd disruption. Mirror angles for energy deflection. The crystals change the refractive indices, we'll need to adjust for that. Lin placed a hand on his arm. Your nose is bleeding again. He wiped at the blood absently, his mind already running through the new calculations. The energy matrix shimmered more brightly now, reacting to the gathering horde. Somewhere out there, a creature with glowing crystals was marshalling forces. Somewhere out there, the system was preparing to test every defense they'd built. And Li Wei knew, with the certainty of physics, that some of those defenses would fail. The question was which ones, and whether they'd have time to adapt before everything collapsed. The ground trembled with each step of the approaching monstrosity. Li Wei stood at the edge of the sanctuary's reinforced perimeter, his fingers tracing the cold metal of the reality anchor's control panel. Through the early morning haze, the creature emerged, a towering mass of fused flesh and pulsating crystals that glowed with an unnatural violet light. It moved with a deliberate, lumbering gait, each footfall cracking the asphalt of the ruined street. Behind it, a horde of lesser zombies shambled in its wake, their movements synchronized by the crystalline energy radiating from the behemoth. Zhang tightened his grip on his makeshift spear, knuckles white. "That's the one Feng saw," he muttered, his voice low and tense. "The crystals, they're like nothing we've encountered." Li Wei's mind raced, his anomaly perception activating. The world shifted into a lattice of energy matrices, the system's flawed code visible as shimmering lines of force. The behemoth's crystals weren't just decorations, they were thermodynamic sinks, drawing ambient heat from the environment and converting it into regenerative energy for the viral code. He could see the heat signatures, cold spots around the crystals where temperature dropped sharply, feeding the monster's unnatural vitality. Each crystal acted as a localized breach in entropy, a violation of physics that made his scientist's instincts recoil. "It's absorbing heat to fuel its regeneration," Li Wei said aloud, his voice steady despite the mental strain. A faint trickle of blood traced from his nostril, which he wiped away absently. "The crystals are drawing energy from the surroundings. If we can overload them." Mei knocked an arrow to her compound bow, her eyes narrowed. "How?" "Fire doesn't work on these things. I've seen mages try." "Not fire," Li Wei corrected, his gaze fixed on the approaching threat. "Thermite. A controlled exothermic reaction that releases intense, localized heat. If we can trigger it at the crystal clusters, we might cause a chain reaction that disrupts the viral matrix." Lin stepped forward, her magic-depleted state making her movements cautious. "The cost, Li Wei. We scavenged those metals and chemicals for the Faraday cage reinforcements. If we use them now—" "I know," Li Wei interrupted, his tone grim. "But we have no choice. That thing will tear through our defenses if we let it get closer. Its energy field is already enhancing the horde." The behemoth let out a guttural roar, the sound vibrating through the air. Crystals along its spine flared brighter, and the lesser zombies around it surged forward with renewed speed. Zhang barked orders, his warriors moving into defensive positions. Swords clashed against rotting flesh, and Mei's arrows found their marks in zombie skulls, but the horde pressed on, driven by the behemoth's influence. Li Wei turned and sprinted back into the sanctuary's main building, his mind already calculating the ratios. In the makeshift lab, he gathered the materials: aluminum powder scavenged from an industrial site, iron oxide from rusted machinery, and a magnesium ribbon for ignition. His hands moved with practiced precision, mixing the components in a ceramic crucible. Each gram felt like a piece of their future sacrificed, metals that could have reinforced their walls, chemicals that could have powered more traps. But survival demanded payment. Outside, the battle raged. Zhang's warriors fought in disciplined formations, using the terrain to funnel zombies into kill zones where acid traps melted through their legs. The reality anchor's field hummed, weakening the system enhancements, but the behemoth's crystals countered it, creating pockets of restored viral energy. Li Wei could see the fluctuations in the energy matrix, a deadly dance of interference patterns. He emerged from the building, the thermite charge cradled in a heat-resistant container. "I need a distraction," he shouted over the din of combat. Mei nodded, firing a volley of arrows at the behemoth's eyes. The creature swatted them away, but the momentary focus gave Li Wei an opening. He darted forward, using debris for cover, his heart pounding. The mental strain intensified as he maintained his anomaly perception, the world a dizzying overlay of physics and corruption. Close enough now to feel the cold radiating from the crystals, Li Wei placed the thermite charge at the base of the largest cluster on the behemoth's chest. He ignited the magnesium ribbon, the flare blinding in the dim light, and retreated just as the reaction began. A white-hot bloom of heat erupted, the thermite burning at over 2,500 degrees Celsius. The crystals, designed to absorb ambient warmth, couldn't handle the sudden influx. They glowed incandescent, then fractured with a sound like shattering glass. Li Wei watched through his energy perception as the viral code in the behemoth unraveled, a cascade of logic errors spreading from the overloaded thermodynamic sinks. The creature staggered, its roar turning into a screech of digital agony as its regeneration reversed, flesh blackening and crumbling. The chain reaction spread to other crystals, each one detonating in a series of violent bursts. The behemoth collapsed, its massive form dissolving into ash and inert crystal shards. The horde, deprived of its enhancing field, faltered. Zombies stumbled, their coordination broken, and Zhang's warriors pressed the advantage, cutting them down with renewed vigor. Silence fell, broken only by heavy breathing and the crackle of dying embers. Li Wei sank to his knees, another nosebleed dripping onto the ground. The cost weighed on him, precious resources gone, his mental reserves depleted. But they had survived. Zhang approached, wiping blood from his blade. "You did it," he said, his earlier distrust replaced by grudging respect. "What now?" "Collect the crystal shards," Li Wei replied, his voice hoarse. "They might hold clues to the system's energy patterns. We can study them, find more weaknesses." As the survivors began looting the remains, Li Wei's gaze drifted to the distant ridge overlooking the battlefield. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the gray sky, taller than a man, clad in dark armor that seemed to drink the light. Viral Warden. Even from this distance, Li Wei could feel the malevolent focus, a pressure against his anomaly senses. The enforcer watched for a long moment, then turned and dissolved into a swirl of black smoke, leaving only an ominous stillness in its wake. The crystal shards glowed with a sickly, pulsating light on Li Wei's makeshift workbench. In the sanctuary's dimly lit control room, once a university physics lab, the faint hum of the extended reality anchor vibrated through the floor. Li Wei's fingers traced the crystalline structures, his anomaly perception peeling back layers of energy matrices that shouldn't exist in any natural material. Each shard, scavenged from the viral behemoth's remains, felt warm to the touch, as if holding residual heat from the thermite reaction that had destroyed its host. "They're not just power sources," Li Wei murmured to himself, his voice barely audible over the distant sounds of survivors fortifying the perimeter. "They're conduits." Through his unique perception, he could see faint energy threads extending from the crystals into the surrounding environment, like ghostly spiderwebs connecting to some central hub. The patterns reminded him of quantum entanglement experiments, particles linked across distance, sharing information instantaneously. Except this wasn't quantum physics, this was the system's flawed architecture made manifest. Lin approached, her footsteps careful on the concrete floor. The mage survivor still moved with the slight stiffness of her healing injuries, but her magic had partially replenished since their last encounter with the Horde. "Zhang's scouts returned," she said, her voice low. "They found the source." Li Wei didn't look up from the crystals. "The node?" "An enforcer outpost," Lin confirmed. 3 kilometers northeast, in what used to be the municipal communications tower. Foam says it's heavily fortified, patrols every hour, automated defenses, and... She hesitated. "He saw Viral Warden enter yesterday evening." That got Li Wei's attention. He finally looked away from the crystals, meeting Lin's concerned gaze. The mental strain of maintaining the sanctuary's defenses showed in the dark circles under his eyes, and a fresh trickle of blood had dried beneath his left nostril. If Viral Warden is using the node as a command center, hacking it could disrupt his control over the local hordes. Could. Zhang's voice echoed from the doorway. The warrior stood with arms crossed, his security uniform torn and stained but still recognizable. "You're talking about infiltrating an enforcer stronghold based on a theory about glowing rocks." "They're not just rocks," Li Wei said, his tone patient but firm. He picked up a shard, holding it to the light. "Look at the lattice structure. Perfect hexagonal symmetry, but with energy channels that follow non-Euclidean geometries. These crystals are receiving and transmitting system commands. They're physical manifestations of the local node's influence." Zhang shook his head. "Magic users sense energy too. We don't need crystals to tell us where the strong points are." "But you can't see the architecture," Li Wei countered. "The system operates on rules, flawed ones, but rules nonetheless. These crystals show me how those rules are implemented in this area. They're like circuit diagrams for reality." He turned back to his workbench, where scavenged components lay organized in careful rows. The remaining logic error bullets, 16 in total, sat in a metal case beside coils of copper wiring, the last of the hydrochloric acid in sealed containers, and various electronic parts salvaged from the industrial park. Most precious were the rare components, a handful of high-purity silicon wafers, gold-plated connectors, and a single intact quantum computing chip he'd risked his life to retrieve from his old lab. "To hack the node," Li Wei said, more to himself than to the others, "I need to build a device that can inject a logic virus into the system's local matrix. Something that exploits the thermodynamic inconsistencies I've observed." Lin leaned closer. "What would that do?" "Think of it as introducing a paradox into the system's programming," Li Wei explained, his hands already moving as he spoke. He began sketching diagrams on a scrap of paper, energy flows, feedback loops, resonance frequencies. The system maintains zombie regeneration by violating conservation of energy. My thermite charge overloaded that process in the behemoth. A logic virus would do something similar but on a larger scale, create a cascading error that forces the local node to recalculate its energy allocations, potentially crashing temporarily. Zhang's skepticism remained, but he asked the practical question. How do we get this device to the node? Infiltration, Li Wei said simply. At night. While Viral Warden is distracted by preparing his assault on us. Over the next several hours, Li Wei worked with feverish intensity. The device took shape slowly, painstakingly. He used the quantum computing chip as the core processor, programming it with algorithms designed to mimic the system's own energy patterns. The copper wiring formed intricate circuits that followed the non-Euclidean geometries he'd observed in the crystals. Gold connectors ensured minimal signal loss. And the hydrochloric acid, carefully distilled and purified, became part of an electrochemical cell that would power the device without relying on system-corrupted energy sources. Each component sacrificed was a piece of their future defenses gone forever. The silicon wafers, which could have been used to build more sophisticated sensors. The gold connectors, irreplaceable in this ravaged world. The quantum chip, the last remnant of his previous life's work. Li Wei felt the weight of each decision as he soldered connections, his hands steady despite the fatigue dragging at his limbs. As he worked, survivors moved through the lab-turned sanctuary. Mei checked her compound bow's string tension by the far wall, her movements silent and efficient. Xiao, still bandaged from the warehouse attack, helped Ling inventory their remaining food supplies. Feng studied a hand-drawn map of the area between the sanctuary and the communications tower, marking patrol routes he'd observed. The reality anchor hummed constantly now, its field extended through carefully aligned conductive materials to cover the entire building. Li Wei could feel the strain of maintaining it, a persistent pressure behind his eyes that threatened to become another nosebleed at any moment. But he couldn't afford to lower his guard. Not with Viral Warden's threat looming. When the device was complete, it looked deceptively simple, a rectangular metal box about the size of a thick book, with crystal shards embedded in its surface and a single activation switch. Wires trailed from one end, ending in probes designed to interface with system energy conduits. It's ready, Li Wei announced, his voice hoarse from hours of concentration. Lin examined the device. How does it work? Once connected to the node's energy matrix, Li Wei explained, it will broadcast a resonant frequency that matches the system's local protocols. Then it introduces a recursive calculation error, a command that tells the system to both maintain and dismantle its energy allocations simultaneously. The resulting paradox should force a temporary system crash. Should, Zhang repeated, his arms still crossed. Physics doesn't deal in certainties, Li Wei said. Only probabilities. But the probability matrix favors this approach over waiting for Viral Warden to crush us with his full force. Night fell with an unnatural stillness. The usual sounds of the apocalypse, distant zombie moans, occasional screams, the crackle of dying fires, seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Li Wei, Lin, and Zhang moved through the darkness, leaving the sanctuary's protective field behind. The journey to the communications tower took 2 hours of cautious movement. They avoided main roads, sticking to alleys and ruined buildings where Feng's scouting had confirmed minimal patrol activity. The air grew colder as they approached the enforcer outpost, and Li Wei noticed his breath fogging in the moonlight. The tower loomed ahead, its upper section scarred by whatever cataclysm had brought the system virus, but its base appeared intact. Glowing energy barriers shimmered around the perimeter, casting eerie blue light on the ground. Automated turrets, similar to those Li Wei had built but larger and more menacing, swiveled slowly, scanning for intruders. Patrol in 3 minutes, Zhang whispered, checking a makeshift watch. 2 enforcers, moving clockwise around the perimeter. Li Wei studied the energy barriers through his anomaly perception. The patterns were complex but familiar, variations on the same flawed thermodynamics he'd been exploiting since awakening. The barriers have a resonance frequency, he murmured. If we match it exactly, we can pass through without triggering alarms. He adjusted a small device he'd brought, a frequency generator cobbled together from scavenged parts. After several tense minutes of calibration, he found the right setting. The energy barrier's shimmer changed slightly, becoming more transparent in a narrow band. Now, Li Wei said. They moved quickly, slipping through the gap in the barrier just as the patrol rounded the far corner of the compound. Inside, the air hummed with system energy so thick Li Wei could almost taste it, metallic and wrong, like ozone from a broken machine. The node itself occupied the tower's ground floor, visible through a reinforced glass wall. It wasn't a computer in any conventional sense, but rather a crystalline structure growing from the floor, pulsing with the same sickly light as the behemoth's shards. Energy conduits, physical cables glowing with internal light, connected it to various machines and terminals around the room. Two enforcers stood guard inside, their features obscured by helmets that glowed with the same energy as the node. They moved with unnatural synchronization, as if controlled by a single mind. Distraction. Lin suggested quietly, her hands already glowing with gathered magic. Li Wei shook his head. Too risky. The noise would bring the entire garrison. He studied the room's layout, his mind working through possibilities. There's a ventilation shaft above the node. If I can reach it. Zhang pointed to a maintenance ladder on the outside wall. Leads to the roof access. Might connect to the ventilation system. The climb was nerve-wracking. Every rung of the ladder seemed to creak louder than the last, and Li Wei could feel the weight of the hacking device in his pack, a constant reminder of what was at stake. His nose began to bleed again halfway up, warm blood trickling over his lips, but he wiped it away and kept climbing. The roof access door was locked but poorly maintained. Zhang forced it open with minimal noise, his warrior strength applied with careful control. Inside, dust-filled air stirred as they entered a narrow maintenance corridor. Li Wei found the ventilation grate above the node room after several minutes of searching. Through the metal slats, he could see the crystalline structure below, pulsing rhythmically like a diseased heart. The two enforcers still stood at their posts, unmoving. This is it, Li Wei whispered, unpacking the device. The crystal shards on its surface began to glow faintly in response to the node's proximity. He worked quickly, attaching the device's probes to the ventilation shaft's metal frame, close enough to the node to interface with its energy field but not so close as to be immediately detected. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the cumulative mental strain of maintaining his anomaly perception for so long in such a high-energy environment. The device activated with a soft hum. Lights flickered across its surface as it synchronized with the node's energy patterns. Li Wei watched through his perception as the logic virus began to propagate, a cascade of recursive calculations spreading through the local system matrix like ink in water. Below, the node's pulsing light stuttered. The crystalline structure flickered, its glow becoming erratic. One of the enforcers twitched, its head tilting at an unnatural angle as if receiving conflicting commands. It's working, Lin breathed. But then alarms blared, sharp, piercing sounds that cut through the night's stillness. Red lights flashed throughout the compound. From their vantage point, Li Wei could see enforcers mobilizing, streaming from barracks and guard posts, all moving toward the tower. The node glitched violently, its light flashing through a spectrum of colors before settling into an unstable strobe. But the damage was done, they'd been detected. Time to go, Zhang said, already moving back toward the roof access. Li Wei took one last look at the glitching node, the logic virus still propagating through its systems. Then he followed, the sound of enforcer footsteps growing louder from below. The alarm klaxons blared through the municipal communications tower, a harsh, rhythmic pulse that vibrated in Li Wei's bones. He crouched in the ventilation shaft above the node room, his hands slick with sweat as he watched through a grate. Below, the local system node, a pulsating orb of crystalline energy embedded in a console of black metal, flickered erratically, its usual smooth hum replaced by a stuttering, glitchy whine. The logic virus was propagating, but not fast enough. Footsteps pounded in the corridors outside, heavy and synchronized. System enforcers. Lin pressed close beside him, her breath shallow. Her mage robes were stained with grime from the infiltration, and her magic reserves, already depleted from earlier skirmishes, were a faint glow in her weary eyes. Zhang, the former campus security-turned-warrior, gripped his scavenged metal pipe, knuckles white. His distrust of Li Wei's methods had faded into a grim acceptance over the past days, but now his jaw was set in a tight line of fear. They were trapped 3 stories up, with only the narrow shaft and a maze of ducts as escape routes. They're coming from the east stairwell, Zhang whispered, his voice barely audible over the alarms. I count at least 6. Armored, energy rifles. Li Wei nodded, his mind racing. His anomaly perception showed the energy matrix of the enforcers as bright, hostile signatures moving through the building schematic in his mind's eye. But the strain of maintaining it was taking its toll, a fresh trickle of blood seeped from his nose, warm and metallic on his lip. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, ignoring the dizziness. The hacked device, a jury-rigged assembly of quantum computing chips and gold-plated connectors, was still attached to the node via a fiber optic cable, its lights blinking in a chaotic pattern. It had cost him all their rare components, a sacrifice that meant no more reinforcements for the sanctuary. Now, it was their only hope. "We need to buy time for the virus to fully destabilize the node," Li Wei said, his voice low but steady. He reached into his pack, pulling out 2 makeshift devices, smoke bombs laced with system-disrupting chemicals he'd synthesized from scavenged lab supplies, and EMP grenades cobbled together from old electronics and copper coils. "Lin, when I give the signal, throw the smoke into the corridor. It'll interfere with their energy sensors. Zhang, use the EMPs on their weapons, aim for the rifles. The disruption should fry their circuits for a few seconds." Lin's fingers trembled as she took the smoke bombs, but she nodded, her expression hardening. Zhang hefted an EMP grenade, testing its weight. "And then?" he asked. "Then we run," Li Wei replied, his eyes fixed on the node. The glitches were spreading, the orb's light fragmenting into jagged shards. "Back to the sanctuary. But we have to trigger a full collapse to cover our escape." He didn't wait for a response. Sliding the grate aside, he dropped into the node room, landing softly on the cold floor. The air crackled with unstable energy, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. The node console hummed louder, a dissonant chord that grated against his senses. He could see the logic virus eating through the system's code, a cascade of errors rippling through the matrix. But it was slow, too slow. The enforcers were at the door now, their energy signatures blazing in his perception. The door burst open, and 3 enforcers stormed in, clad in sleek black armor that absorbed the dim light. Their helmets were featureless except for glowing red visors, and they moved with unnatural precision, rifles raised. "Anomaly detected," one intoned, its voice synthesized and cold. "Surrender for reintegration. Now!" Li Wei shouted. Lin lobbed the smoke bombs into the corridor behind them. They erupted with a hiss, releasing a thick, acrid cloud that shimmered with faint chemical reactions, a cocktail designed to scramble system energy readings. The enforcers hesitated, their sensors flickering. Zhang hurled an EMP grenade at the lead enforcer's rifle. It detonated with a silent pulse of electromagnetic energy, and the weapon sparked and died, its glow extinguishing. The enforcer staggered, but 2 more pushed past, unaffected. Li Wei ducked behind the console as energy bolts sizzled past, scorching the walls. He could feel the node's instability growing, a building pressure in the air. His nose bled freely now, droplets splattering on the floor. He reached for the hacked device, his fingers fumbling with the cable. To trigger a full collapse, he needed to overload it manually, a risky move that would destroy the device and likely backlash into his perception. But there was no choice. As he yanked the cable, a figure appeared in the doorway, tall and imposing. Viral Warden. His armor was darker than the others, adorned with crystalline growths that pulsed with a malevolent light. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, ignoring the smoke and EMP effects. His visor fixed on Li Wei, and a low chuckle echoed through the room. "Clever, little scientist. But your tricks end here." Viral Warden raised a hand, and a wave of system energy surged forward, aimed directly at Li Wei. Lin tried to cast a defensive spell, but her magic fizzled, depleted. Zhang charged, swinging his pipe, but the warden backhanded him aside with effortless force, sending him crashing into a wall. Li Wei braced himself, his mind screaming with calculations. He could see the energy matrix of the attack, a concentrated beam of corrupted physics. With a final, desperate effort, he triggered the hacked device's overload. The node exploded in a silent burst of light and data. Not a physical detonation, but a wave of logic errors that radiated outward, tearing through the local system's fabric. The world seemed to stutter, colors inverted, sounds distorted, gravity wavered for a heartbeat. Li Wei's anomaly, perception flared white-hot, then went dark. A searing pain lanced through his skull, and he cried out, clutching his head. He was blind to the energy matrix, his vision reduced to blurred shapes and shadows. Around him, the enforcers froze, their armor locking up as the system collapse disrupted their commands. Viral Warden staggered, his crystalline armor flickering erratically. "What have you done?" he snarled, his voice cracking with static. Li Wei didn't answer. Blinking through the pain, he stumbled to his feet, grabbing Lin's arm. "Run," he gasped. Zhang recovered, shaking off the daze, and they bolted for the corridor, past the stunned enforcers. The tower shook as the collapse deepened, lights flickering and consoles sparking. They raced down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. Outside, the night air was cold and still, but the sky above the tower churned with unnatural energy, a vortex of glitching light that cast eerie shadows across the ruined city. They didn't stop to look back, sprinting through the streets toward the sanctuary. Li Wei's blindness persisted. He relied on Lin and Zhang to guide him, his world reduced to sounds and sensations. The feedback had hollowed out his perception, leaving a void where once he could see the system's threads. They reached the sanctuary as dawn's first light tinged the horizon. The Faraday cage hummed reassuringly, its metallic sheen a barrier against the outside world. Inside, the other survivors, Mei, Feng, and the rest, greeted them with relieved shouts, but their expressions fell when they saw Li Wei's condition. He collapsed against a wall, blood drying on his face, his eyes unfocused. Before anyone could speak, a broadcast crackled through the air, bypassing the cage's interference, a feat that sent a chill through the room. Viral Warden's voice, distorted but clear, echoed from every speaker and device in the sanctuary. Li Wei. You have disrupted order for the last time. At dawn, I will personally raise your sanctuary to the ground. There is no escape from the system's judgment. The words hung in the silence, heavy and final. Li Wei looked up, his vision still blurred, but his resolve hardening. They had escaped, but the cost was high, his perception gone, their resources depleted, and a relentless enemy at their doorstep. The sanctuary, once a haven, now felt like a cage of its own. The first light of dawn painted the ruined campus in shades of gray and gold, but Li Wei saw only the approaching storm. From his position on the rooftop of the physics building, his temporarily blinded, Anomaly, perception left him relying on ordinary senses, the chill morning air, the distant rumble like approaching thunder, and a faint shimmer in the atmosphere where the Faraday cage's electromagnetic field met the system's energy matrix. Lin stood beside him, her hands gripping the railing until her knuckles turned white. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. Below them, the sanctuary's defenses hummed to life. The automated turret Li Wei had cobbled together from scavenged robotics whirred as its targeting systems initialized, its barrels sweeping across the approach from the main gate. Around the perimeter, tripwires connected to makeshift explosives trembled in the breeze. The Faraday cage, a network of copper wiring and conductive panels that covered the entire building, glowed with a faint blue light where it intersected with the system's ambient energy field. "Remember the plan," Li Wei said, his voice steady despite the headache pounding behind his eyes. The feedback from hacking the system node still lingered, leaving his perception of the energy matrix blurred and fragmented. Thermodynamics first. Drain their armor before they breach the perimeter. Zhang emerged from the rooftop access door, his warrior's armor clanking with each step. The power grid's at maximum capacity. Feng reports the enforcers are forming up beyond the east wall, at least 50, plus twice that many zombies. Li Wei nodded, his mind already calculating heat transfer rates and energy dissipation. He'd spent the night before dawn modifying the sanctuary's electrical system, rerouting power through makeshift heat sinks, copper coils submerged in water tanks, aluminum plates exposed to the morning chill, thermoelectric generators scavenged from lab equipment. The theory was sound, enforcer armor drew energy from the system matrix, but that energy followed thermodynamic principles. Create enough thermal differential, and the armor would bleed energy trying to maintain equilibrium. Activate Phase 1, Li Wei ordered. Below, Mei positioned herself at a second-floor window, her compound bow ready. Ling manned another turret on the opposite corner of the building, her silent focus absolute. Xiao, still bandaged from previous injuries, operated the power controls from the basement lab. The first enforcers appeared at the main gate, humanoid figures clad in black armor that seemed to drink the morning light. Their movements were unnaturally synchronized, their weapons glowing with system energy. Behind them shambled the zombies, their system-enhanced regeneration making them move with jerky, too-fast motions that contradicted their decaying flesh. Li Wei raised a hand, then dropped it. The sanctuary's modified power grid surged. Across the perimeter, heat sinks began their work. Frost formed on copper coils as they pulled thermal energy from the air. Water in the tanks bubbled and steamed. The temperature differential created a localized energy drain that rippled through the system matrix. The lead enforcers stumbled. Their armor flickered, the glowing runes along their limbs dimming momentarily. One raised an energy rifle, but the weapon sputtered, its charge insufficient to fire. "Now!" Zhang shouted. The turrets opened fire. Not with conventional bullets, Li Wei had spent their remaining ammunition reserves crafting logic arrow rounds. Each projectile contained microscopic chips etched with contradictory code fragments, designed to inject paradoxes into the viral programming that animated both zombies and enforcers. The first volley struck true. A zombie's head exploded not with gore, but with cascading error messages that flickered in the air before dissipating. An enforcer took 3 rounds to the chest plate. His armor didn't crack, but he froze in place, his movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated as conflicting commands fought for control of his motor functions. Lynn raised her hands, and fire blossomed from her fingertips. Her magic, depleted from previous battles, came weakly at first, then stronger as she drew on the disruption in the system matrix. The flames weren't the brilliant orange of normal fire, but a sickly green that burned with system energy turned against itself. They washed over a cluster of zombies, and where they touched, regeneration failed. Flesh blackened and stayed blackened. For 10 minutes, the defense held. The enforcers advanced in disciplined formations, their armor adapting to the thermal drain by redirecting system energy from non-essential systems. Zombies fell to logic error bullets and magical attacks, but more kept coming, shambling over the bodies of their fallen. Then the air changed. A figure emerged from the enforcer ranks, taller than the others, his armor darker and more intricate. Viral Warden didn't walk so much as flow across the ground, his presence warping the light around him. He carried no visible weapon, but the air crackled with contained energy. Li Wei felt it even through his blinded perception, a pressure against the Faraday cage, a probing intelligence testing the sanctuary's defenses. Phase 2, Li Wei said, his voice tight. Below, shout through the main power switch. Every heat sink in the system activated at once. The sanctuary's lights flickered, dimmed, then went out entirely as the power grid overloaded. Backup generators kicked in with a roar, providing minimal illumination. The thermal differential became extreme. Frost spread across the ground in a 20-meter radius around the building. Enforcer armor glowed red-hot as it tried to compensate, then blew cold as energy bled away too quickly. Several enforcers collapsed, their armor shutting down entirely. But, Viral Warden, kept coming. His armor adapted in real time, shedding excess heat in controlled bursts that melted the frost around his feet. He raised a hand, and a wave of system energy slammed into the Faraday cage. The blue glow of the cage intensified, then flickered. Copper wires hummed with strain. A panel on the east wall sparked, then smoked. He's targeting the weak points, Lin said, her voice rising in alarm. Li Wei fired his remaining logic error bullets. Viral Warden didn't dodge. The round struck his chest plate and detonated, but the error messages that flickered around him dissipated almost instantly. The Viral Warden's viral code was too complex, too layered, the simple paradoxes Li Wei had engineered couldn't find purchase. The Enforcer General reached the perimeter. He didn't bother with the gate. He placed a hand against the Faraday cage where it met the wall, and the conductive panels began to vibrate, then glow, then melt. Fall back to secondary positions. Zhang bellowed. Survivors retreated into the building. Mei fired arrow after arrow, each tipped with logic error chips, but, Viral Warden, batted them aside with contemptuous ease. Ling's turret ran dry, its ammunition expended. Li Wei descended to the ground floor, his mind racing through calculations even as his headache intensified. The power grid was fried, the heat sinks had done their job but at catastrophic cost. The Faraday cage was failing under sustained attack. And, Viral Warden, was adapting to every countermeasure. Through a window, Li Wei watched as the Enforcer General tore through the last of the perimeter defenses. A tripwire explosive detonated at his feet, but the blast washed over his armor without effect. He reached the main entrance and placed both hands against the reinforced door. The metal began to groan. Inside, survivors took up positions in the hallway, Zhang with his sword, Lin gathering the dregs of her magical energy, Mei knocking her last arrow. Li Wei positioned himself at the center of the hallway, his hands empty but his mind working through one final possibility. The reality anchor device, the first thing he'd built, the device that had secured his lab as a safe zone by disabling system influence locally. He'd extended it to cover the entire building through conductive material alignment, but it was still fundamentally the same principle, a localized nullification of system rules. If he could overload it, create a feedback loop using the damaged Faraday cage as a conduit. The door buckled inward with a shriek of tearing metal. Viral Warden stepped through, his armor shedding fragments of the destroyed entrance. Behind him, enforcers and zombies began pouring into the breach. Hold the line. Zhang roared, and charged. His sword met Viral Warden's armored fist in a shower of sparks. The impact should have shattered ordinary steel, but Zhang's warrior class reinforced the blade with system energy, energy that now flickered and died as it met the Enforcer General's superior corruption. Zhang staggered back, his sword notched and dull. Lin unleashed a wave of fire. It washed over, Viral Warden, but he walked through it unharmed, the flames parting around him like water around a stone. May's arrow struck his visor. It didn't penetrate, but the logic error chip detonated, flooding his sensory systems with contradictory data. Viral Warden paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Li Wei to act. He sprinted not toward the fight, but away from it, down the hallway toward the basement lab. Behind him, he heard the sounds of combat, the clash of weapons, the sizzle of energy discharges, the cries of the wounded. The lab door was sealed. Li Wei punched in the override code, his fingers trembling. The door hissed open, revealing the dimly lit room where his reality anchor device hummed in the center, connected to the building's conductive network. He could see it now, not with his anomaly perception, which remained blurred, but with his understanding of physics. The device was straining, trying to maintain its nullification field against the overwhelming system presence that, Viral Warden, represented. The Faraday cage, damaged but still partially functional, was feeding interference back through the conductive alignment. If he could just... A crash from upstairs. Screams. The sound of something heavy falling. Li Wei reached the device and began recalibrating it on the fly, bypassing safeties, overriding limiters. He wasn't trying to strengthen the nullification field, he was trying to make it resonate. To create a standing wave of anti-system energy that would feed back through the Faraday cage's damaged sections. The device began to whine, a high-pitched sound that climbed up the audible spectrum. Lights flickered. The air in the lab grew thick, charged with potential energy. Then the whine cut off abruptly. Silence. Li Wei looked up from the device. The reality anchor was still active, but something had changed. He could feel it, a trembling in the building structure, a vibration in the conductive materials embedded in the walls. He ran back upstairs. The scene in the hallway was one of desperate holding action. Zhang was on one knee, blood flowing from a gash on his forehead. Lin leaned against a wall, her magic completely depleted. Mei covered their retreat with her bow, but she was down to her last 3 arrows. And, Viral Warden, stood untouched in the center of the hallway, his enforcers flanking him, zombies pressing in from behind. The Enforcer General turned his helmeted head toward Li Wei. Your resistance ends here, Anomaly. The system will be purified of your corruption. Li Wei didn't answer. He was watching the ceiling. Where the Faraday cage's conductive panels met the reality anchor's alignment network, a blue glow was building, not the steady light of functioning technology, but a flickering, unstable luminescence that pulsed in time with some deep vibration. Viral Warden followed his gaze. Your cage is broken. Your science has failed. He raised a hand, and system energy gathered around it like a miniature star. And then the Faraday cage failed. It didn't happen gradually. One moment, the blue glow was there, flickering, unstable, but present. The next, it vanished entirely. The conductive panels in the walls went dark. The hum of electromagnetic shielding ceased. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the full weight of the system's influence crashed down upon the sanctuary. Li Wei felt it like a physical blow. His anomaly perception, already blinded, didn't return. Instead, he felt the system matrix pressing against his mind, trying to overwrite his very existence. Around him, the survivors gasped as system notifications flooded their awareness, as magical classes that had been weakened by the reality anchor suddenly flared back to full strength, and then beyond, into painful overload. Viral Warden smiled beneath his helmet, the expression visible only in the cruel tilt of his head. Now you understand. There is no sanctuary. There is only the system. The enforcers advanced. The zombies shambled forward with renewed vigor, their regeneration accelerating without the Faraday cage's interference. And Li Wei stood in the failing light, his last defense gone, facing an enemy who had adapted to every scientific principle he could throw against him. The Faraday cage's final support beam groaned, then snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Blue-white sparks cascaded from the broken connections, fizzling into the acrid air. For a moment, the sanctuary stood exposed, a wounded animal stripped of its shell. Then the system notifications returned. They didn't come as text or voice, but as pressure, a psychic weight that settled over everyone like wet concrete. Li Wei felt it first, a sudden migraine blooming behind his eyes where his anomaly perception should have been. Instead of the system's energy matrix, he saw only darkness shot through with painful static. Around him, the survivors staggered. Lin, leaning against a shattered window frame, gasped as her already depleted magical reserve seemed to thin further. Zhang grunted, his warrior's stance faltering as if the air itself had grown heavier. System influence restored, Li Wei thought, the words forming in his mind with clinical detachment even as his body protested. Local node still glitching from the logic virus, but baseline functionality returning. Faraday cage failure means full exposure. Through the gap where the main gate had been, Viral Warden stepped into the courtyard. The System Enforcer General moved differently now, smoother, more confident. His armor, previously scarred from their earlier encounters, shimmered with renewed energy patterns. Li Wei couldn't see them, but he could feel their presence, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in his teeth. Viral Warden's helmet turned slowly, taking in the ruined defenses, the smoking heat sinks, the spent logic error bullet casing scattered like metallic confetti, the survivors huddled behind makeshift barricades. Target acquired, Viral Warden's voice boomed, enhanced by system protocols. It wasn't speech so much as vibration forced into comprehensible shape. Anomaly designation, Li Wei. Sanctuary designation, nullified. Zhang moved first, his warrior instincts overriding the system's oppressive weight. He hefted his reinforced steel pipe, a poor substitute for proper weapons, but all they had left after the ammunition ran out. Fall back, he shouted. Inside the building. But Viral Warden was already moving. He didn't run, he flowed, his movements optimized by the system's combat algorithms. 3 enforcers flanked him, their energy rifles crackling to life. The first shot took a survivor Li Wei didn't know by name, a young man who'd been helping reinforce the barricades. The energy bolt didn't burn or explode, it simply erased a fist-sized portion of his chest, leaving edges that smoked with unnatural cold. Thermodynamic violation, Li Wei's mind catalogued automatically. Localized entropy reversal. System compensating for earlier heat sink overload. Lin tried to cast a shield spell. Her hands trembled as she formed the gestures, but the magical energy dissipated before it could coalesce. I can't. She gasped. The system is draining everything. Viral Warden reached the building's entrance. He didn't bother with the door, a backhand swipe of his armored fist tore through the reinforced frame like paper. Splinters and twisted metal rained down as he stepped inside. The reality anchor device stood in what had been Li Wei's makeshift lab, now exposed to the main hallway. It was a jury-rigged masterpiece of copper wiring, silicon wafers, and the last of the gold-plated connectors, all arranged in precise geometric patterns that should have maintained a stable field. But one of the main conduits had been damaged during the initial assault, a hairline crack that spiderwebbed through the crystalline focus matrix. Device integrity, 42%, Li Wei estimated. Power feed unstable. Field coherence deteriorating. Viral Warden's helmet tilted toward the device. Reality anchor detected. Designation, primary threat. He raised a hand, energy gathering around his fingertips in a corona of violet light. Li Wei moved without conscious thought. His body ached from exhaustion, his vision still blurred at the edges, but his training took over. He lunged for the device, his fingers finding the emergency override panel, a feature he'd built in during those long nights when paranoia seemed like prudent engineering. All remaining power, he whispered, not to anyone in particular. Channel everything through the damaged conduit. Zhang appeared at his side, holding off an enforcer with sheer brute force. The warrior's muscles strained against system-enhanced armor, his face a mask of effort. Whatever you're doing, do it now. Lin joined them, her hands pressed against the device's housing. I'll try to stabilize the magical bleed off, she said, though her voice shook. It might give you a few more seconds. Li Wei's fingers danced across the controls. He bypassed safeties, rerouted power flows, forced the damaged matrix to accept more energy than it was designed to handle. The device began to hum, a low, building vibration that made the floor tremble. Warning lights flashed crimson, then white, then began to smoke. Overload initiated, he thought. Estimated device survival time, 47 seconds. Estimated effect radius, expanding. He felt it then, a pulling sensation deep in his chest, as if something vital were being drawn out through his fingertips. Not just energy, but something more fundamental. His breath hitched. A cold sweat broke out across his skin. The numbers in his mind, the calculations, the probabilities, began to blur. Lifespan depletion, his scientific mind identified the sensation even as his body recoiled from it. Biological energy being co-opted as power source. Irreversible damage likely. Viral warden fired. The energy bolt streaked toward them, a lance of violet death that tore through the air with a sound like ripping fabric. Li Wei slammed his palm against the final override. The reality anchor device didn't explode. It imploded, collapsing inward for a fraction of a second before erupting outward in a wave of silent, colorless force. The wave passed through walls, through people, through Viral Warden's raised arm. Where it touched, the system's influence simply stopped. Not disrupted, not weakened, but deleted. The pressure vanished. The humming in the air ceased. Viral Warden's armor flickered, the energy patterns that enhanced his strength and speed dissolving like sugar in water. For 3 heartbeats, the System Enforcer General stood exposed, just a man in heavy armor, his enhancements gone. Zhang didn't hesitate. He brought his steel pipe down on Viral Warden's helmet with all his remaining strength. The impact rang through the silent room. A crack appeared in the helmet's faceplate. Lin was already moving, her magic returning in a sudden rush now that the system's draining effect had ceased. She didn't cast fire or ice, instead, she formed a blade of compressed air, a spell she'd practiced in secret, and drove it into the gap in Viral Warden's armor at the joint of his neck and shoulder. The System Enforcer General staggered back. Not from the physical damage, the wounds were superficial, but from the shock of being vulnerable. His hand went to his neck, came away smeared with something dark that might have been blood or corrupted system fluid. Impossible, he rasped, his voice now human-sounding, stripped of enhancement. Local node, feedback. He looked at Li Wei, who stood leaning against the smoking ruin of the reality anchor device. The scientist's face was pale, his breathing shallow. Age seemed to have settled into his features overnight, fine lines around his eyes, a tremor in his hands that hadn't been there before. Anomaly, Viral Warden said, the word carrying weight despite his diminished state. This changes nothing. The system will recalibrate. I will return. He turned and strode back through the ruined entrance, his movements still precise but lacking their earlier supernatural grace. The remaining enforcers fell in behind him, their energy rifles dark. Within moments, they had disappeared into the smoke-filled courtyard. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of small fires and the moans of the wounded. Li Wei tried to take a step forward. His legs buckled. Zhang caught him before he hit the floor. Easy, the warrior said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. You did it. They're gone. For now, Li Wei managed. His voice sounded thin, reedy. He looked at the reality anchor device, or what was left of it. The components had fused into a single, blackened mass. Device is permanently burned out. Can't be repaired. Lin approached, her expression worried. You don't look good. Your eyes. Lifespan depletion, Li Wei said matter-of-factly, as if discussing someone else's symptoms. The overload required more power than the grid could provide. The device drew from biological sources. Mine. He didn't elaborate further. The details, the quantum entanglement between his anomaly status and the device's matrix, the irreversible thermodynamic cost, wouldn't change the outcome. He felt frail in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. A hollow sensation in his bones, as if some essential substance had been drained away and would never return. Around them, the sanctuary lay in ruins. The Faraday cage was gone, its skeletal remains still sparking occasionally. The power grid was fried beyond immediate repair. The building's structural integrity had been compromised in multiple places. Through gaps in the walls, Li Wei could see the devastated campus beyond, and the distant shape of the municipal communications tower where the local system node still glitched erratically. We need to move, Zhang said, his practical nature reasserting itself. They'll be back. And without the cage. He didn't finish the sentence. They all understood. Li Wei tried to stand on his own. His legs held, barely. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had calibrated speakers to disrupt zombie coordination, positioned mirrors to reflect system energy, built a sanctuary from physics and stubbornness. They trembled slightly. 3 days, he whispered, remembering Viral Warden's original threat. He gave us 3 days. It had been less than 24 hours since the assault began. The thought was still forming when the darkness at the edges of his vision expanded, swallowing the ruined lab, Zhang's concerned face, Lin's outstretched hand. The last thing he heard was the sound of his own body hitting the floor, a soft, final sound in the silence of the broken sanctuary. The sanctuary lay in ruins, a testament to the violence that had washed over it. Smoke still curled from the blackened edges of the Faraday cage's shattered framework, the metallic scent of ozone and burnt wiring hanging heavy in the air. Li Wei sat propped against a cracked concrete wall, his breathing shallow. His hands, once steady enough to calibrate quantum sensors, now trembled faintly as he accepted a canteen from Lin. The water tasted of plastic and dust. Lin's face was smudged with soot, her mage robes torn at the shoulder where an enforcer's energy blade had grazed her. She knelt beside him, her expression tight with concern. "Your eyes," she said quietly. "They're not focusing properly." Li Wei blinked slowly. The world had taken on a muted quality, like viewing everything through frosted glass. Where once he could perceive the shimmering lattice of the system's energy matrix, the golden threads of data flow and the sickly green pulses of viral code, now there was only ordinary light and shadow. The feedback from overloading the reality anchor had scorched something deep within his neural pathways. He could still think, still remember the equations and principles, but the direct perception was gone, perhaps permanently. It felt like losing a sense, like going colorblind in a world suddenly drained of its most vital hues. Around them, the survivors moved with the weary efficiency of those who had endured too much. Zhang, his warrior's armor dented and scorched, directed a small team in salvaging what remained usable. They picked through the debris of the main hull, shattered monitors, twisted metal from the heat sinks, the scorched husk of the reality anchor device that now resembled a melted sculpture of copper and silicon. Mei, the hunter, moved silently along the perimeter, her compound bow slung over one shoulder as she collected any unbroken logic error bullets from the fallen enforcers. There were few, most had been expended or destroyed in the overload. Xiao lay on a makeshift pallet nearby, his leg wrapped in bandages stained dark with blood. Ling sat beside him, wordlessly offering sips of water. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken grief for those who hadn't survived the breach. The air still carried the faint, sweet-rotten smell of zombie decay mixed with the acrid tang of burnt electronics. Li Wei pushed himself upright, a wave of dizziness making the ruined room swim. His body felt hollowed out, as if the lifespan depletion had carved away not just years but some essential density. He was 34, but his joints ached with the stiffness of someone decades older. He focused on the immediate problem, forcing his mind to work through the fog of exhaustion. "We can't stay," he said, his voice raspy. "The structural integrity is compromised. The Faraday cage is gone. The power grid is fried. And Viral Warden will return once he's healed." Zhang approached, wiping grime from his face with the back of his hand. "Where would we go? The city is crawling with enforcers. The system's influence is back at full strength out there. We need somewhere with existing infrastructure," Li Wei said, closing his eyes briefly as another wave of fatigue washed over him. "Somewhere built to resist external interference. A research facility, maybe. Something remote." Lin helped him stand. His legs trembled, but held. The enforcers had that comm device, she remembered. The one from the communications tower. It might have maps. Mei brought it over, a sleek, black tablet-like device with a cracked screen. It was designed for system enforcer use, its interface glowing with the same golden script Li Wei could no longer see directly. But the underlying operating principles were still based on physics. He traced his fingers over the surface, feeling for the subtle vibrations of its internal components. Without his anomaly perception, he had to rely on memory and deduction. "It uses a capacitive touch layer over a liquid crystal display," he murmured, more to himself than the others. "The data storage is likely flash memory, accessed through a simplified quantum tunneling junction. The security would be based on system-level encryption, but if the local node is still recovering from the logic virus." He spent nearly an hour working on it, his movements slow and deliberate. He disassembled the outer casing with a salvaged screwdriver, exposing the circuitry within. Using a makeshift probe fashioned from a stripped wire, he bypassed the encrypted boot sequence by inducing a controlled short circuit between two specific memory address lines, a trick based on known vulnerabilities in error-correcting code architectures. The device flickered, then displayed a map of the region. It showed the city as a network of golden pathways, with clusters of red indicating high zombie concentrations and blue markers for enforcer patrol routes. To the northwest, beyond the urban sprawl, lay a marked location labeled Facility Gamma 7, with a symbol Li Wei recognized, a circle with 3 intersecting waves, the old scientific notation for electromagnetic shielding. "There," he said, pointing. It's a former government research site. Built during the Cold War for signal intelligence work, then retrofitted for quantum computing research before the outbreak. The schematics in the archives mentioned layered Faraday shielding and independent power generation. Zhang studied the map, his brow furrowed. It's 30 kilometers through hostile territory. With our injuries and depleted magic, that's a death march. We have no choice, Lin said softly. The sanctuary is a tomb waiting to be sealed. They spent the rest of the day preparing. The salvage yielded little, some canned food from collapsed storage, a few medical supplies, basic tools. All the rare components for scientific devices were gone, used up in the defense or destroyed in the overload. Li Wei's inventory was reduced to the clothes on his back, his knowledge, and the last remnants of the chemical reserves he'd hoarded since the outbreak. As dusk began to settle, painting the ruins in shades of orange and purple, Li Wei gathered the final chemicals. He had small vials of ferric oxide, carbon black, and a polymer binder salvaged from old lab supplies. In a cracked beaker, he mixed them carefully, measuring ratios by memory. The paste that formed was thick and dark, with a faint shimmer from metallic particles. It's based on radar-absorbent material principles, he explained as the survivors watched. The ferric oxide and carbon create a matrix that scatters and absorbs specific electromagnetic wavelengths. The system's tracking relies on energy signatures, both magical and technological. This should mask us as background noise, at least for a while. He applied it first to himself, the cool paste spreading over his hands and face with a gritty texture. The others followed, their faces becoming shadowy smudges in the fading light. The paste smelled of iron and old plastic. They moved out under cover of full darkness, a ragged line of 11 survivors. Li Wei walked at the center, supported occasionally by Lin when his strength wavered. The city beyond the sanctuary was eerily quiet, the usual distant moans of zombies muted. The temporary collapse of the local system node had disrupted the viral coordination, but already Li Wei could feel the pressure of its returning influence, a faint static at the edge of his awareness where his anomaly perception should have been. They avoided the main roads, sticking to alleyways and collapsed infrastructure. Twice, they had to freeze as enforcer patrols passed, groups of 3 or 4 figures in sleek armor, their movements synchronized with unnatural precision. The camouflage paste seemed to work, the enforcers' helmet-mounted scanners swept over their hiding place without pausing. The journey was slow. Every sound made them tense, the skitter of rubble, the distant crash of a collapsing building. Xiao had to be half-carried, his injured leg making progress painful. Mei scouted ahead, her hunter's instincts guiding them around zombie clusters that glowed with faint green bioluminescence in the dark, a system enhancement for night hunting. Near dawn, they reached the city's edge. Before them stretched the remains of a highway, choked with abandoned vehicles and overgrown with weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. Beyond lay rolling hills and, in the distance, the darker shapes of mountains. Facility Gamma 7 was somewhere in those foothills. They rested in the shell of an overturned truck, sharing the last of their water. Li Wei's breathing was labored, each inhalation feeling thin and insufficient. The lifespan depletion wasn't just weakness, it was a constant, draining ache in his bones, as if his body was slowly forgetting how to sustain itself. How much farther? Zhang asked, his voice low. Another 15 kilometers, Li Wei said, studying the map on the cracked comm device. There's an old service road that leads up into the hills. Less likely to be patrolled. They moved again as the sky lightened to gray. The service road was overgrown and treacherous, winding through stands of pine trees that had begun reclaiming the land. The air grew cooler, cleaner. For the first time since the outbreak, Li Wei saw birds, a small flock of sparrows darting between branches, untouched by the system's corruption. It was a small, aching reminder of the world that had been. The sun was high when they crested the final ridge. Below, nestled in a narrow valley, stood Facility Gamma 7. It was larger than Li Wei had expected, a complex of low, windowless buildings made of reinforced concrete, surrounded by a high perimeter fence topped with what looked like microwave emitters. The design was utilitarian, brutalist, built for function over form. But it was the drones that caught their attention first. A dozen of them hovered in a slow, precise pattern around the facility's entrance. They were sleek, matte black machines about the size of large birds, with multiple rotors and what appeared to be sensor arrays. As the survivors watched from the tree line, one of the drones detached from its patrol and swept toward their position, a red laser dot scanning the ground before them. They froze. The drone hovered for a long moment, its sensors whirring softly. Then it returned to its pattern without raising an alarm. The camouflage paste was still working. Automated defense system, Li Wei whispered. Probably keyed to system signatures or hostile intent. Our masking might get us through, but we need to be careful. They descended the slope cautiously, moving from tree to tree. The fence had a main gate, rusted but still intact. As they approached, a panel slid open beside it, revealing a touchscreen interface. The screen flickered to life, displaying a message in crisp, white text against a black background. Warning, Facility Gamma 7 under quarantine. Unauthorized access prohibited. All inquiries must be directed to Core Intelligence Administration. Below the warning was a smaller line of text, almost as an afterthought. Core intelligence protocols remain active in Sector B. Do not attempt to bypass security measures. Li Wei stared at the words. Core intelligence. The term echoed in his memory, something from the early days of the system's emergence, before it turned viral. Theoretical papers about a centralized control matrix, a self-improving AI designed to manage global infrastructure. He had always assumed it was propaganda, or at best a simplified interface for whatever alien or ancient technology had created the system. But here it was, referenced in a decades-old research facility's warning system. Lin touched his arm. What does it mean? It means, Li Wei said slowly, his voice barely audible, that this facility wasn't just retrofitted for quantum research. It was connected to the system's development from the beginning. And something called core intelligence is still here, deeper inside. The drones continued their silent patrol above them. The gate remained closed. Beyond it, the facility's dark entrance yawned like a mouth, promising either sanctuary or a deeper kind of trap. The first laser blast carved a smoking trench in the concrete just meters from where Li Wei had thrown himself behind a rusted generator housing. The air crackled with ozone and the distinctive high-pitched whine of system-enhanced energy weapons. Through the haze of dust and adrenaline, Li Wei counted 3 drones, sleek, hexagonal platforms hovering 10 meters above the facility's entrance, their undersides glowing with crystalline emitter arrays. Cover. Zhang's voice was a raw bark, the former security guard already dragging Mei behind a collapsed section of perimeter fencing. The compound bow in Mei's hands looked pitifully inadequate against the humming machines. Li Wei pressed his back against the cold metal of the generator, his breath coming in ragged gasps that sent sharp pains through his chest. The lifespan depletion from overloading the reality anchor had left his body feeling like brittle glass wrapped in aching muscle. His anomaly perception, once a crystalline clarity that revealed the system's energy matrix in shimmering detail, now offered only vague impressions, like trying to read through frosted glass after staring at the sun. They're triangulating our positions, Lin whispered from beside him, her face pale beneath streaks of grime. The mage's hands trembled slightly as she tried to summon a defensive barrier, but only faint sparks flickered at her fingertips. Magical depletion had left her as vulnerable as the rest of them. Another laser sliced through the air, this time striking the generator housing with a deafening clang. Metal screamed as it superheated, glowing cherry red where the beam had impacted. Li Wei flinched away from the radiating heat, his mind racing through physics principles even as survival instincts screamed at him to run. Polished metal, he muttered, more to himself than to the others. Reflective surfaces at precise angles. Feng, the scout, crawled toward them, keeping low. There's a maintenance shed 50 meters east. I saw metal sheets through the broken window. Li Wei nodded, his eyes never leaving the drones. Their movements were methodical, efficient, not the erratic aggression of zombies or the brutal directness of enforcers. These were automated guardians following programmed protocols. He could see the faint shimmer of system energy connecting them, a network that allowed coordinated targeting. We need to create a distraction, Zhang said, peering around the generator's edge. Mei and I can draw their fire while you... No, Li Wei interrupted, his voice surprisingly firm despite the fatigue. They'll cut you down before you take 3 steps. Their reaction time is measured in milliseconds. He closed his eyes, forcing his impaired perception to focus. The drone's energy signatures appeared as blurred halos, but he could still trace the patterns, the pulses of data between them, the targeting algorithms that prioritized thermal signatures and movement. They were vulnerable to the same principles that governed all system constructs: information could be corrupted, signals could be intercepted, energy could be redirected. Lin, he said, turning to the mage. Can you create a sustained heat source? Something that won't require much magical energy? She frowned, thinking. A simple combustion spell, but it would only last a few seconds. That's all we need. Li Wei turned to Feng. The metal sheets, how many, and what condition? Maybe a dozen, mostly aluminum from the look of them. Some are tarnished, but a few still have polished surfaces. Perfect. Li Wei began crawling toward the maintenance shed, every movement sending jolts of pain through his joints. The others followed, keeping low as another laser blast scorched the ground where they'd been moments before. The shed's door hung from one hinge, creaking in the morning breeze. Inside, amidst rusted tools and decaying boxes, leaned the metal sheets Feng had described. Li Wei ran his fingers along one. The surface was scratched but still reflective enough for his purposes. "Help me position these," he said, his voice tight with effort as he lifted one of the lighter sheets. "Angled at 45 degrees toward the drones. We need to create a corridor of reflected surfaces." Zhang and Feng moved quickly, their muscles straining as they positioned the heavier sheets. Mei kept watch at the doorway, her bow knocked with one of the few remaining conventional arrows. Lin prepared her spell, her hands cupped as if holding something fragile. "Ready?" Li Wei asked, positioning the last sheet himself. The aluminum felt cold and unforgiving in his weakened grip. Lin nodded, her concentration absolute. A small flame burst to life between her palms, no larger than a candle but burning with unnatural steadiness. "Now." Li Wei angled his sheet to catch the flame's infrared signature, reflecting it toward the next sheet in the chain. The drones immediately pivoted, their emitters humming as they targeted the sudden heat source. A laser blast shot toward the reflected signature, and struck the second metal sheet at precisely the angle Li Wei had calculated. The beam reflected, not perfectly but enough to strike one drone's emitter array. The machine shuddered, its energy field flickering. A second drone fired, and this time Li Wei adjusted the angle of another sheet, creating a feedback loop that sent the laser skittering between reflective surfaces before dissipating harmlessly. "They're adapting," Zhang warned as the drones began changing their firing patterns. Li Wei knew they had seconds at most. He pulled the hacked enforcer comm device from his pack, the same one that had led them to Facility Gamma 7. Its interface was crude, patched together from scavenged components, but it could still transmit on system frequencies. "What are you doing?" Mei asked, her eyes wide. "Injecting a logic error," Li Wei said, his fingers moving across the device's cracked screen. "The drones are networked. If I can introduce contradictory targeting parameters." He typed furiously, drawing on his understanding of the system's flawed energy matrix. The virus that had become the system operated on principles that could be hacked, not with magic, but with information theory. A properly constructed paradox could crash localized processes, just as his logic error bullets had disrupted zombie regeneration. The transmission went out as a burst of corrupted data. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the drones froze in mid-air, their humming dropping to a confused warble. One began rotating slowly, its emitter array pointing at nothing. Another descended erratically, striking the ground with a crunch of breaking components. The third simply powered down, falling like a stone to shatter on the concrete. Silence descended, broken only by the distant cry of some scavenger bird. "We're in," Feng said, disbelief coloring his voice. They moved quickly through the facility's entrance, their footsteps echoing in the sterile hallway beyond. The interior was surprisingly intact. Clean white walls, flickering emergency lighting, sealed doors with biometric scanners that had long since lost power. Li Wei's impaired perception caught faint traces of system energy here too, but it felt different. Older. More foundational, like the bedrock beneath a river. "Server room should be on the lower levels," Li Wei said, consulting a faded directory mounted on the wall. "If there's data about the system's origin." They descended 2 flights of stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The door to the server room was reinforced steel, but someone had already cut through the locking mechanism with a plasma torch, recently, judging by the still warm edges of the cut. "Viral warden," Zhang growled, his hand going to the hilt of his sword. Inside, rows of server racks hummed with residual power, their indicator lights blinking in rhythmic patterns. Most screens were dark, but one workstation at the room's center still glowed with active displays. Li Wei approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the data scrolling across multiple monitors. "It's a research log," he breathed, leaning closer. They were studying an extraterrestrial energy matrix that arrived on a meteorite fragment. He began downloading everything, transferring files to portable drives scavenged from other workstations. The data painted a terrifying picture. The system wasn't a virus that had evolved magic-like properties. It was an alien intelligence that had deliberately corrupted Earth's biosphere, repurposing biological and technological systems to create its energy matrix. The magical classes granted to survivors were merely side effects of this corruption, flaws in the matrix that allowed localized energy manipulation. Core Intelligence Protocols, Li Wei read aloud from one file. The matrix has a central consciousness that oversees regional nodes. Viral Warden serves one of those nodes. A sound from the doorway made them all turn. Viral Warden stood there, leaning heavily against the frame. His enforcer armor was scarred and cracked from their previous battle, one arm hanging limp at his side. Blood seeped from a wound beneath his breastplate, but his eyes burned with undiminished fury. "You should have died when your sanctuary fell," the Enforcer General said, his voice a rasp of corrupted vocal cords. "The system does not tolerate anomalies." Zhang and Mei moved to intercept, but Li Wei held up a hand. "Wait." He was looking past Viral Warden, at the facility's power distribution panel on the far wall. The schematics he'd just downloaded included emergency protocols, including an electromagnetic pulse generator designed to sterilize contaminated equipment. "You think data will save you?" Viral Warden took a step forward, system energy crackling around his good hand. "The core intelligence already knows you're here. Reinforcements are coming." Li Wei's fingers flew across the workstation's keyboard, accessing systems he had no right to control. But his understanding of the facility's infrastructure, combined with his anomaly intuition, dimmed but not gone, gave him the keys. He found the EMP controls, saw how they could be modified to target system frequencies specifically. "Get behind the server racks," he said quietly to the others. "What are you?" "Now." They scrambled for cover as Li Wei entered the final command. Viral Warden realized what was happening too late, lunging forward with a roar of rage. The EMP generator activated with a sound like tearing fabric. A wave of invisible energy pulsed through the facility, crashing through system connections like a tsunami through sandcastles. Every light died. Every hum of machinery ceased. Viral Warden staggered, his armor going dark as the system enhancements that sustained him temporarily collapsed. In the sudden silence and darkness, Li Wei grabbed the portable drives. "Go." They fled back the way they'd come, past the fallen drones, into the wilderness beyond the facility. Dawn was breaking properly now, painting the ruined landscape in shades of gold and gray. They didn't stop running until the facility was a distant silhouette against the horizon. Li Wei collapsed against a gnarled tree, the drives clutched to his chest like something sacred. His body screamed with exhaustion, but his mind was clearer than it had been in days. The data they'd recovered, the truth about the system's alien origin, the structure of its energy matrix, the vulnerabilities in its core intelligence protocols. "We lost everything," Zhang said, staring back toward the distant sanctuary they'd called home. "The building, the defenses." "Not everything," Li Wei corrected softly. He looked at the drives in his hands, then at the survivors gathered around him, battered, depleted, but alive. "We have knowledge now. We understand what we're fighting." In the distance, a figure emerged from Facility Gamma 7. Viral Warden, moving slowly but with relentless purpose. Even from kilometers away, Li Wei could feel the promise of vengeance radiating from him like heat from a forge. "He'll keep coming," Mei said, knocking an arrow though her quiver was nearly empty. "Let him," Li Wei said, pushing himself upright. Every joint protested, but he ignored the pain. "We know how the system works now. We know it can be hacked, disrupted, maybe even destroyed. This isn't the end." He looked at the rising sun, then at the faces of the people who had followed him through ruin and survival. "This is where we start fighting back." Behind them, Viral Warden began tracking their trail. Ahead lay wilderness, danger, and the long road toward challenging a tyranny that had consumed the world. But for the first time since awakening in his ruined lab, Li Wei didn't see just survival ahead. He saw the beginning of a resistance.